No warning preceded its arrival. The void at the edge of Segmentum Obscura split open without ceremony, without the telltale distortions of warp translation that Imperial augurs had been trained to detect for 10,000 years. One moment the star-swept darkness lay empty. The next, something vast occupied the space between worlds. The Arc of Dominion measured 15 kilometers from prow to stern, 9 across its widest span. It was not built. It had grown a ship creature of purple-hued metal that pulsed with bioluminescence, as if a heart still beat within its hull. No plasma drives scorched the void behind it. No warp engines bled reality at its flanks. It simply was hanging in the black like a star that had learned to breathe. On the surface of Voltor Prime, a hive world of 40 billion souls, the first alarms began their screaming. Orbital defense platforms swiveled their lance batteries toward the anomaly. Their machine spirits gibbered in binary panic, unable to classify what their sensors reported. Not Eldar, not Necron, not Tyranid, though the organic signatures resembled something that might have crawled from a hive ship's belly. The defense cogitators cycled through 10,000 years of xenological data and found nothing. In his command throne aboard the orbital fortress, Bastion Eternal Admiral Hestus Varn watched the Pict screens with the studied calm of a man who had witnessed 3 Black Crusades. His augmetic eye whirred, attempting to focus on the vessel's indistinct edges. "Distance," he asked. 1.3 million kilometers and holding, Admiral." His Auspex officer's voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "It made no deceleration burn. Velocity readings are inconsistent. Vox hail, transmitted on all Imperial frequencies. No response." Varn's flesh hand drummed once against the throne's armrest. "Weapons status. Lance batteries charged. Nova cannons loaded. We can kill it, sir." Could they? The Admiral's instincts, honed across 4 decades of void warfare, whispered otherwise. That ship radiated wrongness, not the corrupt stench of chaos, but something colder, something that looked at the Imperium's might and felt nothing. "Open fire," he commanded. Emperor's mercy upon the Arc of Dominion opened first. From ports along its hull, beams of purple energy lanced outward. They did not burn with plasma heat or crackle with las fire. They simply erased. Where the light touched Bastion Eternal's void shields, reality folded inward like paper meeting flame. The shields collapsed without the explosive discharge that should have accompanied such catastrophic failure. They just stopped existing. The beams punched through 15 meters of adamantium armor as though it were parchment. Admiral Varn had time to see his bridge crew flash burn to ash, time to feel the air sucked from his lungs as the hull breached. Time to understand that whatever had come to Voltor Prime was not something the Imperium could fight with conventional weapons. Then he was vapor scattered across the void, alongside the debris that had once been the sector's mightiest fortress. The purple beams swept outward in measured arcs. 3 orbital platforms died in the first salvo, 6 more in the second. The remaining stations fired everything Lance Strike's macro cannon shells, missile volleys that could have leveled continents. The projectiles accelerated toward their target and stopped. Every shell, every las beam, every torpedo arrested mid-flight as though time itself had developed a conscience. They hung suspended in the void, a frozen constellation of Imperial wrath rendered impotent. Within the Ark's command chamber, Garjugenshoup extended his telekinetic awareness across the battlefield. The octopoid creature's body floated in a sphere of purple light tentacles, twitching as he manipulated gravitational fields with contemptuous ease. His psychic voice echoed through the ship's organic corridors. "Primitive. They still rely on projectile weapons." The suspended ammunition began to spin. Slowly at first, then faster, until each piece became a blur of tortured metal. Garjugenshoup inverted the gravitational field around the remaining orbital stations. The ammunition returned to its creators at twice the velocity. The platforms exploded from within as their own ordnance tore through magazines and reactor cores. Voltor Prime's orbital defense grid, which had repelled 3 Orc WAs in a chaos incursion, died in minutes. Below on the hive world's surface, 300 billion eyes turned skyward. They watched stars die. They watched the wreckage rain down through the atmosphere, trailing fire like funeral pyres. They watched and they knew. Death had arrived with the purple light. In the depths of the Ark, Melzigard walked through corridors that breathed. The multi-headed warrior's regenerative tissue rippled with anticipation. Each of his 5 heads saw the world differently. Heat motion, energy, fear, death. Together they perceived prey. He spoke, and 5 voices harmonized into one. Grorabas, the master permits us to descend. Nearby, something shifted in the shadows, something that might have been called beautiful, if beauty could be defined by perfect lethality. Grorabas stood 4 meters tall, his acid-secreting carapace shimmering with colors that should not exist in nature. When he moved, the metal floor hissed and pitted beneath his claws. The weak planet's defenses are broken. Grorabas rumbled, his voice like stone grinding bone. I shall prepare the gift. No. The word echoed from everywhere and nowhere, silencing both commanders instantly. I go first. Lord Boros emerged from his meditation chamber. He was humanoid, in the way a blade is humanoid, possessing the basic shape but refined for a single purpose. 2 meters tall, shoulders broad enough to break doorways, skin the color of storm clouds shot through with veins of luminous purple. His single eye, centered in his forehead, blazed with light that had incinerated suns. No armor covered his flesh. No weapons hung at his sides. He needed neither. The 2 commanders bowed, not from protocol, but from the same instinct that makes prey lower its head before a predator. Boros walked past them to the observation portal. Volter Prime hung in the void, its 3 hive cities visible as scabs of light against the planet's poisoned surface. 40 billion lives, 40 billion voices screaming into their crude communication devices, calling for their god emperor to save them. How disappointing, Boros said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. It was the voice of someone who had searched 1,000 galaxies and found them all wanting. They break so easily. He turned to Geryugenshoup. Commence bombardment. Leave nothing. As you command, Lord Boros. The Ark's main cannons charged with a sound like reality tearing. Not the roar of plasma ignition, not the whine of capacitors overloading. Something deeper, the sound of biological fusion of a living reactor preparing to vomit its hatred across the void. The first beam struck Hive Primus. 23 billion souls lived in that city, stacked in layers that reached 15 kilometers into the toxic ski. The beam cut through it like a last scalpel through flesh, and the city didn't explode. It dissolved. Habitation blocks that had stood for millennia simply ceased molecular cohesion. Metal, stone, flesh all returned to component atoms in a purple flare that lit the hemisphere. The second beam took Hive Secundus, the third Hive Tertius. In 47 seconds, 40 billion voices fell silent. Boros watched the planet die and felt nothing. No satisfaction. No guilt. Not even the distant echo of the excitement that had once driven him to conquest. Just the familiar gnawing emptiness that had become his only companion across the stars. Geryugenshoup, he said. Are there others? Other worlds in this system? Scanning indicates 2 agri-worlds, 1 Forge colony and 3 orbital stations designated as Mechanicus. The Forge world possesses significant defensive installations. Then we continue. Boros turned from the observation portal. Perhaps somewhere in this galaxy, someone will prove strong enough to make me feel something before they die. He walked back toward his chambers, leaving his commanders to their work. Behind him, Volter Prime burned. Its atmosphere ignited, turning the entire world into a funeral pyre that would burn for weeks. The ashes of 40 billion souls rose into the void, indistinguishable from stellar dust. Within the hour, 3 more worlds joined the fire. The distress beacon from Volter Prime reached Terra 17 days later, carried through the warp by an automated servitor whose last act was to trigger the emergency transmission before succumbing to radiation poisoning. In the Senatorum, Imperialist Fabricator General Udia Raskian reviewed the fragmented data stream with mounting horror. The Picti captures were incomplete, degraded by warp transit, but they showed enough. A vessel, purple light, 40 billion dead in under an hour. The Fabricator General's mechadendrites trembled, a wholly inappropriate emotional display for one of his rank. He issued priority protocols to every naval command within 5 sectors. Deploy all available battle groups, classify the threat as Omega class, prepare exterminatus protocols as contingency. But in his calculations running on cognition engines that had served the Omnissiah for 3 centuries, a single probability kept recurring: 0.003% chance of successful void engagement. The number terrified him because it meant the machine spirits themselves could not comprehend what approached. And if the machines blessed by the Omnissiah, touched by sacred logic, could not understand it, then perhaps it was beyond human understanding entirely. Fabricator General Raskian made the sign of the cog and whispered a prayer to the God Emperor. Then he added a second prayer when he had not spoken since his flesh had first been replaced by sacred steel. He prayed for a quick death. Aboard the Ark of Dominion, Boros stood alone in the observation chamber. Before him, the galaxy stretched in all its violent glory. Billions of stars, trillions of worlds, an infinity of potential opponents. And yet, "I will find one," he whispered to the void. "One creature in this entire galaxy strong enough to make the fight worth finishing." His reflection stared back from the viewport, a warrior god with power enough to shatter planets trapped in a prison of his own invincibility. The emptiest prisoner in the cosmos. The purple light of the Ark flickered and the ship moved deeper into Imperial space, leaving a trail of dead worlds in its wake. Behind it, the stars guttered and died like candles in a wind. The silence of dead worlds followed the Ark like a shroud. 6 systems had fallen in as many weeks. Not conquered, erased. Where the Imperium's fortress worlds had stood, only debris fields remained spinning slowly in the void, like memorial cairns of shattered adamantium and frozen corpses. The Ark of Dominion moved through the graveyard it had created, searching for something that could look back at it without fear. Boros stood in his meditation chamber, surrounded by darkness, broken only by the purple luminescence of his own flesh. He had not moved in 3 days. Did not need to. His body drew energy from sources that would have killed lesser beings. Cosmic radiation, gravitational tides, the background scream of the universe itself. But energy was not what he lacked. "Lord Boros," Geryuganshup's psychic voice rippled through the chamber. "We detect anomalous readings at the system's edge. Something approaches." Finally, Boros's eye opened, blazing with renewed interest. "Show me." The chamber's walls dissolved into tactical displays. At the periphery of the Hadron system, a lifeless place of asteroid fields and dying stars, something moved. Not ships, not fleets, a living tide. The shadow in the warp announced itself like the drawing of a blade across reality's throat. Geryuganshup's tentacles spasmed as the psychic pressure hit him. In the lower decks, lesser crew members began screaming, clawing at their heads as the hive mind's presence scraped against their minds. Boros felt it too, that vast alien hunger. For the first time since arriving in this galaxy, his lips curled into something that might have been a smile. Tyranids. Geryuganshup gasped, fighting to maintain coherence against the psychic onslaught. Hive fleet designation unknown, living vessels count exceeding, sensors cannot maintain accurate tally, minimum estimate 12,000, ETA 43 minutes. Boros walked to the viewport. The Tyranid swarm became visible even to naked sight, a living constellation that blotted out the stars. Organism ships ranging from small drone forms to cathedral-sized hive ships, all connected by invisible threads of synaptic command. The shadow in the warp intensified, and Boros felt something he had not experienced in years: anticipation. "Grorabas, Melzagard," he commanded. "Prepare for boarding action. Geryuganshup maintain defensive screens, but do not fire. Let them come." "My lord?" The psychic's confusion bled through his words. "They will attempt to consume the Ark." "Good." Boros's eye blazed brighter. "Let them try." The Tyranid assault began with the subtlety of an avalanche. Spore mines erupted from the living vessel's launch organs, millions of floating death seeds that drifted toward the Ark on solar winds. Behind them came mycetic spores, drop pods of flesh and chitin, each carrying dozens of warrior forms. The swarm moved with perfect coordination, thousands of ships adjusting their approach vectors to create an inescapable net. No banners, no vox, only hunger given orders. The Ark did not flee, did not maneuver. It simply waited, a purple star in the darkness, as the tide of teeth and claws descended. The first spore mine detonated against the hull. Acid bioplasma washed over the ship's exterior, sizzling against the organic metal. A dozen more followed, 100. The Ark's outer skin blistered and burned, but beneath the damaged tissue, new growth was already regenerating. Mycetic spores slammed into the hull and split open like rotten fruit. Hormagaunts poured out their scything talons, sparking against metal as they sought purchase. Termagants followed their weapons, already firing streams of bioacid and living ammunition. Within minutes, the Ark's exterior was carpeted with Xenos flesh. Inside the ship, Gorobas waited. The acid specialist stood in the primary ingress corridor, his carapace gleaming with toxic secretions. Around him, the walls wept. Purple ichor, where the tyrannids had already begun burning through. He could hear them, the scraping of a million claws, the hissing of bioweapons, the inhuman chittering that served as their communication. The wall dissolved. Hormagaunts flooded through the breach in a tide of chitin and hunger. They did not slow, did not hesitate. The hive mind had identified prey and issued its only command: devour. Gorobas laughed, a sound like glass breaking underwater, and spread his arms wide. His carapace erupted. Acid sprayed outward in a pressurized wave, catching the first rank of Hormagaunts mid-leap. Their chitin armor evolved to resist las fire, and bolter rounds dissolved like sugar in water. The creatures didn't even have time to scream before they became puddles of genetic slurry. More poured through. Always more. The tyrannid swarm knew no fear, felt no hesitation. For every warrior that fell, 3 more took its place. Gorobas waded into them, each touch of his claws reducing alien flesh to bubbling slag. His laughter rang through the corridor, mixing with the hiss of dissolving carapace and the wet sounds of melting tissue. "Is this all you have?" he roared at the endless tide. "I am Gorobas, chosen of Lord Boros. Your hunger means nothing to—" A carnifex burst through the far wall. The living tank was 4 meters of armored fury, its biocannons already firing. Gorobas twisted aside, but the bioplasma bolt caught his shoulder, spinning him into the wall. He recovered instantly, acid already pooling in his primary glands when he saw them. Genestealers. 3 of them moving through the swarm with horrifying grace. Their forearms ended in claws that could shear through ceramite, and their movements possessed a terrible intelligence that the lesser forms lacked. Gorobas grinned. Finally, worthy prey. He launched himself forward, meeting the carnifex head-on. His claws punctured its facial chitin, injecting concentrated acid directly into its skull. The creature bellowed a sound that vibrated through the deck plating and slammed him into the floor with piledriver force. The Genestealers struck while he was down. They moved as one, a synchronized attack pattern that would have dissected a space marine in seconds. Gorobas rolled his carapace, taking gouges that would have been fatal to anything else. He caught one Genestealer by the throat, squeezed, felt its neck dissolve in his grip. The second one he kicked, sending it crashing back into the Hormagaunt swarm. The third one's claws found the weak point beneath his primary shoulder plate. Gorobas felt the talons slide between his armor segments, felt it pierce the acid sac within. His eyes widened. Not in pain, he had transcended pain centuries ago, but in understanding. The acid sac ruptured, his internal chemistry designed to produce the galaxy's most corrosive compounds went critical. The acids meant to be projected outward began dissolving him from within. Gorobas looked down at his chest and watched his own flesh start to bubble and run. "Ah," he said almost conversationally. "Clever." He looked up at the swarm, at the carnifex, recovering at the remaining Genestealers, circling at the endless tide of lesser forms, pressing in from all sides. The hive mind had recognized him as a threat and adapted, evolved a counter-strategy, used his own strength against him. For the first time in his long service, Gorobas felt something like respect for his enemy. He whispered into the ship's organic communication network, "I have failed you, but I will not die pointlessly." He triggered every acid gland simultaneously. The explosion was not fire or force. It was dissolution itself made manifest. Everything within 30 meters tyrannid metal air reduced to component atoms. The blast carved a sphere of absolute destruction through 3 decks, leaving only a smooth-walled cavity that steamed with chemical heat. When the vapor cleared, Gorobas was gone. So were 400 tyrannid warrior forms and a significant portion of the Ark's internal structure. But the swarm kept coming. On the observation deck, Melzigard tore through tyrannid warriors with methodical efficiency. His 5 heads tracked separate targets, his regenerative tissue allowing him to ignore wounds that would have crippled anything else. A warrior's bone sword severed his left arm. The limb regrew in seconds. Acid blood splashed across his chest, the damaged flesh sloughed off and replaced itself. Melzigard's heads assessed at once Gorobas fallen, the swarm adapting. Only one response adapt faster. The 5th head did not speak. It opened its maw and let out a pressure rip that turned synaptic signals to static for 100 meters. Gerjugenschub appeared beside him, floating in his sphere of purple light. The octopoid's tentacles trembled from maintaining defensive screens against the psychic pressure of the hive mind. "The swarm has breached 17 sections," Gerjugenschub reported. "Casualties among lesser crew total. They are inside our walls, Melzigard. We cannot contain them." "Then we do not try," Melzigard's 5 voices harmonized. "Lord Boros has given no order to withdraw. We hold until he commands otherwise." A hive tyrant smashed through the viewport behind them. The alpha creature was 3 meters of perfected killing evolution, its 4 arms wielding bone swords that crackled with bioelectric charge. The shadow in the warp intensified around it. This was a synapse creature, a node in the hive mind's network. Gerjugenschub didn't hesitate. He inverted gravity around the tyrant, crushing it against the ceiling with force sufficient to liquefy bones. The creature's carapace cracked. Its internal organs ruptured. It regenerated. The hive mind had learned from watching them fight, adapted. The tyrant's biology rewrote itself in real time, developing denser bone structure, redundant organs, accelerated healing that mimicked Melzigard's own regeneration. Gerjugenschub breathed, "Impossible," but Melzigard knew better, inevitable. This is what evolution looks like when it has consumed a galaxy's worth of genetic material. The tyrant struck. Gerjugenschub raised gravitational barriers, but the bone swords punched through them as if they were paper. One blade took off 3 of Melzigard's heads. Another pierced Gerjugenschub's sphere, scattering purple light like shattered glass. The octopoid psychic felt his tentacles twitching. Melzigard's 3 remaining heads stared at the tyrant as his severed heads regenerated, the process slower now, taxed by continuous damage. Gerjugenschub could barely focus through the shadow's weight. The tyrant advanced. Behind it, more synapse creatures emerged from the breach. Hive Guard, Tyrannid warriors, a carnifex that had to bend nearly double to fit through the doorway. The swarm was concentrating its elite forces, recognizing the commanders as primary threats. Melzigard looked at his dying companion, then at the approaching Xenos. His 5 heads smiled in unison. "Then rest, old friend," he said. "I will hold them long enough for Lord Boros to witness what we truly face." He charged. In his meditation chamber, Boros watched the battle through the Ark's sensory organs. He saw Gorobas's sacrifice, saw Melzigard fighting impossible odds, saw Gerjugenschub fallen, struggling against the psychic weight of the hive mind. His commanders were dying. His ship was being devoured from within. The tyrannid swarm had proven itself not just strong, but adaptable, capable of learning, evolving, overcoming. And Boros felt nothing. The disappointment cut deeper than any blade. He had hoped, truly hoped, that these creatures might provide the challenge he sought. But watching them fight, watching them adapt and overcome, he understood the fundamental flaw. The tyrannids were not warriors. They were hunger given form. They did not seek glory or challenge. They simply consumed, moving from prey to prey with the mechanical efficiency of a cosmic digestive system. There was no will to test himself against, no warrior spirit to match his own, just appetite. Boros rose from his meditation. The chamber doors exploded outward, torn from their moorings by pure kinetic force. He walked through the corridors of his dying ship, passing compartments where tyrannid forms fought his remaining crew. They turned toward him, the hive mind recognizing the greatest threat. He did not slow. A carnifex charged. Boros caught it by the head and continued walking. The creature's skull crumpled under his grip. Its massive body dragged along the floor before he casually tossed it aside, the corpse crashing through 3 bulkheads before coming to rest. Warriors surrounded him. Their bioweapons opened fire. The projectiles splashed harmlessly against his skin. Boros reached out almost gently and touched the nearest warrior's carapace. The creature flash combusted from internal heat, its own body turning against it as every cell simultaneously reached critical temperature. It had time to emit a single confused psychic bleat before it became ash. Boros continued forward, leaving a trail of incinerated tyrannid corpses in his wake. He found Melzagard still fighting. The multi-headed warrior had lost 2 of his 5 heads again, his regeneration failing under sustained assault. A hive tyrant had him pinned against a wall, its bone swords buried in his chest. Boros appeared beside them. The hive tyrant's head simply ceased to exist, not blown apart, not crushed. It erased, deleted from reality by the sheer energy output of Boros's presence when he chose to focus it. "Melzagard," Boros said softly, "you have served well. Rest." The warrior slid down the wall, his remaining heads nodding in gratitude and exhaustion. Boros walked to the observation deck. Through the shattered viewport, he could see the tyrannid fleet, 12,000 bioships and armada that had consumed worlds now concentrated on a single target. He raised his hand. The energy began building in his palm, a sphere of purple-white light that hurt to look at directly. It grew, fed by the same cosmic furnace that powered his body. The temperature in the deck rose 1,000 degrees. The metal walls began to glow cherry red. "You are hungry," Boros said to the fleet, to the hive mind itself. "Then eat this." He released the sphere. It expanded outward from the ark in a wave of annihilation that traveled at near light speed. The first bioships simply evaporated their organic hulls, unable to withstand energy concentrated enough to ignite fusion reactions. The wave spread, washing over the fleet like a tsunami of starfire. 12,000 ships died in 40 seconds. When the light faded, only debris remained, fragments of chitin armor drifting in the void, already beginning to freeze. The hive mind's presence vanished like a light switched off the shadow in the warp, receding as abruptly as it had arrived. Silence reclaimed the Hadron system. Boros stood amid the wreckage of his observation deck, surrounded by tyrannid corpses that were already beginning to decay without the hive mind's sustaining presence. He felt the familiar emptiness settle over him again, heavier now. Geryugenshub dragged himself upright, tentacles trembling. He could still navigate. Barely. "Plot a course deeper into this galaxy's interior," Boros commanded. "Perhaps there are others who fight for more than mere survival." He turned away from the viewport, walking back toward his chambers. Behind him, maintenance protocols were already beginning to repair the ark's damaged sections, organic metal flowing like water to seal breaches. In the medical bay, Melzagard's 5 heads regenerated slowly, the process taxed by the battle's intensity. Beside him, Geryugenshub floated in his sphere tentacles, still shaking from psychic strain. But Gorobus did not regenerate. His genetic template had been destroyed in the blast, dissolved along with everything else within the sphere of his final sacrifice. For the first time since joining Boros's service, there were only 2 commanders aboard the Ark of Dominion. The ship moved deeper into Imperial space, leaving the Hadron system behind. In its wake, the frozen corpses of 12,000 tyrannid vessels drifted in orbital patterns that would persist for millennia, a graveyard that future explorers would find and wonder at. They would one day call it the Field of Dissolution. They would never know what had created it. In the observation chamber, Boros sat alone in the darkness. He thought of Gorobus, the warrior's final laugh, his casual courage in the face of certain death, the efficiency of his sacrifice. A good death, a warrior's death, but not the death Boros sought, not for his subordinate, for himself. "Somewhere," he whispered to the void, "somewhere in this galaxy must be someone who can give me what I seek." The purple light of his flesh pulsed in the darkness, a lonely star burning in an infinite void, searching for another flame bright enough to meet its own. The search continued. The Ark sailed on. The tomb world had no name. Once perhaps it had been called something in a language that predated human speech by 60 million years. But the Necrons who had awakened within its catacombs did not remember names. They remembered only purpose, endure, expand, exterminate. The Ark of Dominion emerged into real space, 3 astronomical units from the planet's dead surface. No warp wake, no translation scars, only presence. No alarm sounded, no defense grid activated. The world simply observed their arrival with the patient attention of something that had outlived stars. Boros stood at the observation port studying the planet below. It was a sphere of tarnished silver and green necrodermis pockmarked with geometric structures that hurt the eye to perceive angles that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space spires, that bent light around themselves like wounds in reality. Melzigard observed his regenerated heads tilting in unison. No biosigns. No atmospheric composition suitable for organic life. No. Gerjugenschub corrected his psychic senses, straining against something that resisted detection. Not lifeless, deathless. There is something down there, many somethings, but they do not register as living matter. Boros said nothing. He simply watched the planet turn on its axis with the mechanical precision of a clock gear. After the Tyranid's ravenous hunger, this cold patience felt almost refreshing. "Take us closer," he commanded. The Ark descended. They detected the fleet when they were halfway to the planet's surface. The Necron vessels emerged from dimensional pockets, reality folding aside to permit their passage like curtains drawn by invisible hands. Scythe-class harvest ships, Shroud-class light cruisers, Cairn-class tomb ships that dwarfed even the Ark's considerable bulk. 20 vessels materialized in perfect geometric formation, their hulls reflecting no light, absorbing all electromagnetic radiation like wounds in space. And at their center, a Pharaoh of the Sautek dynasty observed the newcomers with eyes that had witnessed the birth of galaxies. Overlord Zathanoth stood upon the command dais of her flagship, the Eternal Theorem. Her form was a masterwork of necrodermis and ancient technology, elegant where her lesser kin were merely functional, adorned with the captured treasures of 100 conquered worlds. The hyperphase blade at her hip hummed with quantum instability, eager to reduce matter to its component particles. She studied the purple vessel through sensors that could track individual atoms across light years. Organic, alien, powerful. The calculations ran through her engram matrix in nanoseconds, weighing threat assessment against strategic value. Unknown configuration. Her cryptech reported the technician's voice a rasp of static. Biomechanical hybrid. Energy readings inconsistent with known xenoform classifications. Power output exceeds theoretical maximums for vessels of that displacement. Then our theories require revision. Zathanoth's voice carried the cold authority of one who had commanded armies when humanity's ancestors were still aquatic. Scan for tactical weaknesses, prepare Gauss batteries, transmit the standard ultimatum. The message that reached the Ark was not sound or electromagnetic pulse. It was pure mathematical concept burned directly into their ship's sensory organs through quantum entanglement. You have entered the dominion of the Sautek dynasty. Surrender your vessel. Your organic components will be cataloged. Resistance is extinction. Boros read the message and laughed, a sound without humor, dry as tomb dust. Arrogant machines. They think they can catalog us. He turned to his remaining commanders. Gerjugenschub, target their command vessel. Melzigard, prepare boarding procedures. I wish to see these deathless ones up close. The Necron fleet opened fire. Gauss batteries lanced across the void beams of sickly green energy that didn't burn or pierce. They unmade. At the molecular level, matter touched by Gauss weaponry simply ceased cohesion, flaying apart into component atoms. It was not destruction. It was decohesion. The beams struck the Ark's hull and began their terrible work. Armor plating that had withstood Tyranid bioweapons started to dissolve, peeling away in layers of dissociated particles. Entire sections of the outer hull vanished, exposing the ship's organic infrastructure to the void. But the Ark was alive, and living things heal. New tissue erupted from the wounds even as the Gauss beams continued their assault, regeneration racing against dissolution in a grotesque competition. The ship's hull rippled like muscle beneath skin, growing faster than the Necrons could unmake it. Gar-Jugenschub extended his telekinetic awareness across the battlefield. He had fought entropy itself in the form of tyrannid hunger. These machines, precise and logical, would fall to a different approach. He inverted the gravitational field around the nearest Shroud-class cruiser. The vessel didn't crumble or implode. It simply ceased maintaining structural integrity as every atom was pulled in a different direction simultaneously. The cruiser came apart like a puzzle box whose pieces had decided to return to storage, perfectly orderly, utterly catastrophic. 2 more ships died the same way before the Necrons adapted. Zathanath observed the losses with the detachment of one who had seen entire dynasties rise and fall. Her warriors could be rebuilt, her ships could be reconstructed. But the technique the organic vessel employed, gravitational manipulation of that magnitude, required immediate countermeasures. Chronometric stabilizers activated. The Eternal Theorem's Doomsday Array charged energy sufficient to crack Moon's building in its firing chamber. When it fired, the beam didn't travel. It simply erased the space between weapon and target, causing the intervening distance to cease existing. The beam caught the Ark amidships. For 3 seconds, a section of the vessel simply wasn't there, deleted from reality like words scraped from parchment. Organic corridors ended in smooth-edged voids. Crew compartments opened directly into vacuum. The Ark screamed through channels that weren't quite sound. A psychic wail of agony that made even the Necron's deadened sensors crackle with feedback. Then it began to regenerate. Tissue flowed like liquid metal, filling the void, reknitting what had been erased. Slower than before, much slower but undeniable. The ship's regeneration was adapting to the Doomsday weapon's effects, learning how to restore not just matter, but the space that matter had occupied. Zathanath's optic sensors flickered the Necron equivalent of surprise. Her cryptech's static-laced voice carried urgency for the first time in millennia. All vessels concentrated Gauss bombardment on regeneration sites. The strategy was simple: disassembly faster than restoration. The fleet complied with mechanical precision. 20 vessels firing as one, their Gauss weapons creating a web of dissolution that wrapped around the Ark like a funeral shroud. Inside the dying ship, Boros felt each wound as if it were his own. The pain was not physical. His body had transcended such limitations, but something deeper. The Ark had served him for centuries, carried him across galaxies, been both vessel and companion in his endless search. And these machines were killing it with the cold efficiency of surgeons. Melzagard, go to them. Show them what it means to face the living. The warrior bowed his 5 heads and departed. The boarding torpedo was not built. It was grown a bullet of flesh and fury that punched through the Eternal Theorem's hull like a fist through paper. Melzagard emerged into corridors of living metal, his 5 heads already tracking targets. The Necron warriors came in perfect phalanxes, their Gauss flares raised in synchronized precision. They did not charge, did not roar. They simply advanced with the patient inevitability of entropy itself. Melzagard laughed with all 5 mouths and met them. His regenerative flesh meant nothing to Gauss weapons. Each beam that touched him flayed away layers of tissue, dissolving his body one molecular layer at a time. But he was faster than their targeting systems could track, and for every piece they unmade, his cells divided to replace it. He tore through the first rank like a storm through wheat. His claws, harder than diamond, sharper than monofilament, found the weak points in necrodermis armor and exploited them. Warriors fell in pieces, their limbs scattered, their torsos rent, but they did not die. Green light flared in their eye sockets as resurrection protocols engaged. The scattered pieces began to phase out, returning to tomb complexes deep in the planet below, where they would be reconstructed, returned to combat readiness, sent back to die again. One warrior intoned through corrupted vox, "You cannot kill what was never alive." Melzagard's 4th head vomited bioacid not as potent as Gorobas's payload, but concentrated enough. The acid ate through necrodermis like water through salt, exposing the warriors' inner mechanisms. Their resurrection protocols failed when there was nothing left to phase out. But more came, always more. The corridors seemed to spawn warriors from the walls themselves, immortals with heavier weapons, Lichguard with hyper-phase blades that could cut through his regeneration faster than he could restore it. Canoptek, wraiths that phased in and out of reality to strike from impossible angles. Melzigard fought like a god in his death throes, magnificent, doomed, glorious. Each head commanded a different aspect of combat, creating a five-pointed storm of violence that left the corridor walls scored with claw marks and painted with both crimson blood and silver ichor. But he was tiring. The Gauss weapons were unmaking him faster than he could regenerate. The hyperphase blades were finding his vital cores, the 5 gems hidden within his flesh that contained his consciousness, his life, his self. A Lichguard's blade found the first core. Melzigard's rightmost head went dark, the gem within shattered into dust. He screamed not in pain, but in rage at the diminishment at being made less. A wraith materialized behind him. Its claws, phasing between dimensions, bypassed his flesh entirely and crushed 2 more cores simultaneously. Melzigard collapsed to his knees, 2 heads remaining. His regeneration sputtered, failing. Around him, the Necron forces closed in, not with triumph, but with the mechanical satisfaction of a problem being solved. "Interesting specimen," a new voice spoke. Overlord Zathanoth approached through the ranks of her warriors, her hyperphase blade drawn. "You fought well. Your resilience was noteworthy, but resilience without adaptability is merely postponed failure." Melzigard's 2 remaining heads looked up at her. Even dying, even diminished, his eyes held defiance. The blade descended. 1 core shattered. The final head went dark, but the last core deep in his primary torso flickered. Faint, stubborn, alive. Zathanoth raised her blade for the killing stroke. The corridor exploded inward. Boros stood in the breach, his single eye blazing with light that made necrodermis burn. He moved faster than Zathanoth could track. One moment at the entrance. The next, his hand wrapped around her throat, lifting her off the deck. "You will not take him." He tore the final core from Melzigard's chest with his free hand, a gem pulsing weakly with dying light, and shoved it into his own flesh for safekeeping. Melzigard's body collapsed, 4 heads darkening, but the core lived. Zathanoth triggered her translocation beacon. Green light engulfed her, phasing her back to the tomb world below, before Boros could crush her neck entirely. Warriors and Lichguard converged. Boros swept his arm in a wide arc. The Necrons disintegrated not from impact, but from sheer thermal energy, their necrodermis bodies flash vaporizing before they could phase out. He walked back through the corridors he'd carved, cradling Melzigard's final core like an ember. Behind him, the Eternal Theorem listed its systems, failing, preparing emergency phase-out. By the time he returned to the Ark, the Necron fleet was regrouping for another assault. The octopoid psychic floated in his sphere tentacles, trembling as he maintained defensive screens against the Gauss barrage. The Ark was dying around him, its corridors filling with vacuum as section after section was unmade. Lesser crew members had already perished. Soon it would be only him and Lord Boros alone against an enemy that could not be killed. "My lord," he transmitted through the dying ship's neural network. "Melzigard has fallen. The vessel is lost. We should know." Boros's voice carried a weight that made reality itself seem to pause. "I will not flee from machines, Geryugenshoup. I need you to do something for me, one final service. Anything, Lord Boros. Buy me time, 3 minutes, that's all I need." Geryugenshoup understood. He had served Boros long enough to know what that tone meant. The Lord was preparing to unleash power that would reshape the battlefield, power that required concentration, preparation, and time he did not have. 3 minutes, the psychic echoed. He would have bought 3 hours if asked. 3 minutes will suffice. Geryugenshoup closed his 3 eyes and opened himself to the fundamental forces of the universe. His telekinetic abilities had always been formidable, capable of manipulating gravity across cubic kilometers. But now, with nothing left to lose and everything to prove, he reached deeper. The space around the Necron fleet began to distort, not just gravity, space-time itself. Geryugenshoup pulled at the fabric of reality, creating eddies and whirlpools in the dimensional medium. Necron vessels that tried to maneuver found themselves caught in spatial loops, arriving back where they started. Gauss beams that fired at the arc were bent back on themselves, forced to travel inclined bottle trajectories that had no beginning or end. Impossible. Zathanath's cryptech reported. The readings indicate localized space-time manipulation beyond theoretical maximums. The organic is creating. Lord Zathanath, it's creating microscopic black holes. Geryugenshoup screamed not in pain but in exertion. His body evolved to manipulate gravity had never been designed for this magnitude of force. His tentacles were tearing themselves apart at the cellular level. His 3 eyes bled ichor. His sphere of purple light cracked like eggshell fragments falling away to reveal the failing flesh beneath. But he held. 3 Necron vessels were caught in his gravitational trap, their hulls beginning to compress as micro-singularities formed at their cores. They phased out before they could be destroyed completely. Emergency protocol sending them back to tomb complexes for repairs. 2 minutes. Zathanath calculated, assessed, decided, concentrate all batteries on the psychic. The entire fleet turned its attention to Geryugenshoup. 20 Gauss cannons fired simultaneously. The beams converged on his position from 20 different vectors, creating a cage of dissolution from which there could be no escape. His sphere shattered completely. His tentacles began to unmake, flaying apart molecule by molecule. But still he held the spatial distortions in place. 3 minutes. Geryugenshoup's consciousness began to fragment as his brain tissue dissolved. In his final moments, he thought of Gorobas's laughter, of Melzagard's unwavering loyalty, of Lord Boros's endless search for meaning in a meaningless cosmos. I am Geryugenshoup, he thought as his body came apart. Greatest psychic of the dark matter thieves, and I held for 3 minutes. His telekinetic grip released, the spatial distortions collapsed. The micro-black holes evaporated in flashes of Hawking radiation. And Geryugenshoup, who had moved planets, who had crushed starships with thought alone, who had held reality itself in his tentacles, scattered into atoms across the void. In the meditation chamber of the dying Ark, Boros opened his eye. He had felt them both die. His commanders, his companions, his only friends in 60 million years of searching. Gorobas to hunger, Melzagard to precision, Geryugenshoup to time itself. They had given everything. Now it was his turn. Boros rose and walked through the dissolving corridors of his ship, where he passed the very air-ignited particles exciting to plasma from proximity to the energy building within him. The walls glowed cherry red, metal dripped like wax. He emerged through a breach in the hull and stood in the void facing the Necron fleet alone. Zathanath observed him through her sensors, a single organic standing in hard vacuum radiating energy that made her instruments scream in protest. She calculated attack vectors, assessed threat levels, prepared firing solutions, and felt something she had not experienced in 60 million years of unliving existence. Doubt. Boros raised one hand toward the fleet. The energy gathering in his palm was no longer purple. It had transcended color, bleeding into wavelengths that biological eyes could not perceive and mechanical sensors could barely register. It was the light of stellar cores, of cosmic furnaces of forces meant to exist only in the hearts of dying suns. He spoke across the void, his voice carried by gravity waves and quantum fluctuations. You are patient. You endure where others perish. You have mastered death itself, but I have mastered life, and life burns brighter. He released. The blast was not an explosion. It was a directed stellar emission, a beam of concentrated fusion that turned the void itself incandescent. It caught the eternal theorem at the prow and burned through 15 kilometers of living metal in less than a second. Zathanath triggered her translocation beacon as her ship came apart. Her last thought, unprecedented. Then she was scattered atoms and complex mathematical patterns transmitted back to the tomb world below for eventual reconstruction. Her ship was not so fortunate. The beam bisected it, and the eternal theorem pride of the Sautek dynasty, victorious in 10,000 battles, came apart in a catastrophic chain reaction of failing systems and overloading power cores. The secondary vessels opened fire, their Gauss weapons flaying Boros from 20 angles simultaneously. His flesh dissolved, his muscle tissue unmade, his bones began to show through as molecular layers were stripped away. But he did not die, could not die, not while his core still burned with energy drawn from the cosmos itself. He fired again, and again. Each blast claimed a Necron vessel, sending it either to oblivion or back to its tomb in scattered pieces. The fleet broke formation the first time Zathanoth's forces had retreated in living memory. By the time Boros stopped, only 7 of the original 20 vessels remained. They fled to the planet below, phasing into underground complexes where they could regroup, rebuild, and plan new strategies. Boros watched them go. His body was a ruined Gauss. Weapons had flayed away half his mass, exposing his still beating heart to vacuum. But already he was regenerating, pulling energy from background radiation, from cosmic rays, from the death scream of his ship. The Ark of Dominion drifted, a skeletal carcass of living metal, flensed to its superstructure yet not dead. It would heal. It always did. In the bio-cradle, 4 of Melzegard's cores lay shattered. 1 glimmered faint, stubborn, alive. Geryugenshoup was gone. 200 crew lay with him among the shards. The Tyranids devour Boros, told the stars. The Necrons endure. Neither understands how to fight for glory, for meaning. He turned toward the deeper galaxy. Somewhere perhaps there was one who chose the fight. The Ark limped into the dark, its wounds knitting by inches. Behind it, the silent legions returned to patience beneath their tomb world. Boros, Dominator, 1 commander, lost 1 in abeyance. The loneliest flame in the cosmos flew on. The search continued. He turned his gaze toward the deeper galaxy where unknown worlds awaited, where perhaps there might be someone who understood. Someone who fought not because they had to, but because they chose to. Someone who could meet him as an equal, not as prey or obstacle, but as a warrior. "I will find you," he promised the void, "even if I must burn this entire galaxy to ash." His body finished regenerating. Energy gathered around him, not for another attack, but for propulsion. He had no ship now. He would travel as he had in the ancient days before the Ark, when he had crossed between stars on nothing but will and power. Boros looked back once at the tomb world, where deep beneath its surface, Zathanoth was already being reconstructed. Her memory engrams restored from backup, ready to resume command. They would meet again, perhaps. But next time he would not be impressed by their endurance. Next time he would see if they could learn to truly die. The living star ignited his aura and burned across the void, leaving the silent legions to their patient vigil among the tombs of their ancient empire. Behind him, the debris field that had been the Ark began its slow, eternal orbit, another graveyard in a galaxy of graves. But Boros, Dominator, Lord of the Dark Matter Thieves, last of his commanders, most lonely flame in the cosmos, flew on. The search continued. The webway was not space. It was the echo of a war fought when humanity's ancestors still crawled from primordial seas, a labyrinth carved into reality's underside by beings who had mastered the art of making distance irrelevant. Tunnels of light that bent physics into submission passages where cause preceded effect, corridors that existed in 10,000 places simultaneously. And into this ancient architecture, something wrong forced its way. The Ark of Dominion limped through the void, its hull a patchwork of scar tissue and raw regeneration. Where Gauss weapons had flayed it to skeletal framework, new growth sprouted like grotesque fungus, purple-hued metal that pulsed with bioluminescence, weeping fluids that froze instantly in vacuum. The ship was dying, had been dying for weeks, but it refused to acknowledge the fact. Boros stood in what remained of the observation chamber, watching the stars through cracks in the hull. Behind him, in the bio-cradle that served as the ship's medical bay, Melzegard's regeneration continued with agonizing slowness. 1 core, 1 flickering ember of consciousness struggling to rebuild a body from genetic memory and stubborn refusal to cease. From the cradle came a voice, thin, unfinished, insisting it could fight. Boros turned. Melzigard stood or tried to stand in the cradle's amniotic suspension. His new form was wrong. One head instead of 5 asymmetrical limbs, regenerative tissue that flickered between solid and liquid states. The single core in his chest glowed faintly visible through translucent flesh. Boros denied him. Healing came first. Until then, Melzigard would wait. Melzigard bowed and sank back into the suspension fluid. His body was already breaking down, the incomplete regeneration unable to sustain itself. He had days, perhaps hours, but he would stand when called. That much Boros knew. The Ark's sensory organs detected the anomaly 3 minutes later. Space folded. Not the violent rupture of warp translation, but something more elegant, reality stepping aside to permit passage like a curtain drawn by invisible fingers. A doorway opened in the void, its edges bleeding rainbow light that should not exist in the material universe. A webway gate. Boros approached the viewport, his single eye narrowing. The gate was small, unstable, its perimeter flickering like a dying flame. Beyond it, he glimpsed corridors of light that hurt to perceive, geometry that made his brain insist multiple contradictory things were simultaneously true. Geryugenshub would have understood this, he said to the empty chamber. He would have mapped the topology, calculated the vectors, warned me of the dangers. But Geryugenshub was scattered atoms drifting somewhere in the void near a tomb world. I go forward, Boros continued, because that is what I do. The arc accelerated. On Craftworld Ulthway, the alarm began as a whisper in the Infinity Circuit. Farseer Eldorath Starbane felt it like ice water poured directly into her soul, a wrongness approaching something that did not belong in the skein of fate. She opened her eyes, her pupils bleeding white light as she dove deeper into the psychic network. A living star, the vision showed her, purple fire, a ship that breathes. It approaches the auxiliary gate near the Crone's Passage. Warlock Mechu beside her named it impossible. That gate had been sealed millennia ago. The vision shifted. Eldorath saw the gate open, not forced. Not breached, but yielding, as if reality itself recognized the newcomer's right to passage. She saw the ship enter, saw the webway's ancient architecture groan under the weight of something it was never designed to contain. Sound the call, she commanded. Wake the wraith constructs, every warrior to the aspect shrines. Sealing the gate would only tear it wider. They would have to fight not to win, but to buy time for evacuation. Her fingers traced runes in the air. Each gesture pulled potential futures from the skein, discarding those that ended in absolute annihilation, searching for threads where Ulthway endured. She found none. Mechu spoke quietly. They would fight to choose how they died. No. Eldorath's eyes refocused, seeing the present with terrible clarity. We fight to choose how it remembers us. The arc entered the webway like a fist through silk. The gate resisted for exactly 3 seconds, its ancient mechanisms attempting to reject the foreign vessel to maintain the integrity of the passage. Then the Ark's biohull adapted its exterior tissue, reconfiguring to match the webway's dimensional frequency. Not perfectly, not elegantly, but enough. The gate stretched, bulged, accepted the intrusion with a sound like reality sobbing. Boros felt the shift the moment they crossed the threshold. The webway was not vacuum. It was not space. It was architecture made of light and mathematics, corridors where distance became negotiable and time flowed in eddies. The Ark's organic sensors screamed in protest, trying to process input that violated their fundamental operational parameters. The passage ahead was a tunnel of crystalline light, its walls flowing with colors that had no names in any living language. Runes flickered across the surfaces. Eldari script warning signs, wards meant to repel demons and protect travelers. They flared as the arc passed, then died, unable to comprehend what they faced. Not demon, Boros observed. Not warp spawn. Their protections were designed for beings of the Imperium. He was something else. Something their ancient architects had never anticipated. The tunnel curved ahead, bending through dimensions the human mind could not properly perceive. The arc followed its damaged hull, scraping against the passage walls. Where it touched the crystalline surface, cracked bleeding light like luminous ichor. They were a kilometer into the webway when the first defenders appeared. The Wraithguard materialized in perfect formation, 20 constructs of wraithbone and psychic circuitry, each one a vessel containing the preserved soul of a fallen Eldari warrior. They moved with mechanical precision, their wraith cannons already tracking the approaching vessel. Behind them, Exarch Morlantier of the Dire Avengers stood in his azure armor, his power weapon humming with psychic charge. His tactical visor displayed target vectors, threat assessments, projected casualties. All of them were unacceptably high. The command went out across all frequencies: hold the line. The Wraithguard opened fire. Wraith cannon fire was not laser or plasma. It was probability itself, made weapon beams that reached into the quantum substrate of reality and deleted specific outcomes. Matter touched by Wraith cannon fire didn't explode or burn. It simply ceased to have ever existed in that configuration. 20 beams struck the Ark's prow simultaneously. A section of hull vanished, not destroyed, but excised, as if reality had performed surgery and removed the unwanted tissue. The void where the hull had been was perfectly smooth, the cuts so precise that molecular bonds remained intact at the edges. The Ark's regeneration attempted to fill the gap. New tissue sprouted, then vanished as follow-up shots deleted it before it could fully form. The constructs advanced, maintaining, suppressing fire, forcing the alien vessel to choose between regeneration and forward momentum. It chose neither. The Ark simply ignored the damage and continued forward. From breach ports along its flanks, something launched not projectiles, but a living form. Melzigard hit the webway floor in a crouch, his incomplete body already sprinting toward the Wraithguard line. His regeneration was catastrophic. The new form barely held cohesion, one head malformed limbs tissue that flickered between states of matter. But he was fast, and the single core in his chest burned with the light of something that refused to acknowledge its own impossibility. He reached the first Wraithguard before it could retarget. His claws, grown from compressed bone and desperate will, found the weak points in Wraithbone armor and tore. The construct came apart, its spirit stone tumbling free, screaming psychically as it fell. The line adjusted. 19 Wraithguard redirected fire. Melzigard dodged through probability itself, moving where the cannons predicted he wouldn't be, exploiting the infinitesimal lag between targeting calculation and beam emission. 3 more constructs fell before the webway itself betrayed him. The corridor twisted, space folding at right angles to reality. Melzigard found himself running on what had been the ceiling, then the wall, then back to the floor, as local gravity inverted with each step. The Wraithguard, designed to fight in the webway's mutable geometry, adapted instantly. A beam caught him in the chest. Not a direct hit, glancing, clipping his shoulder, but enough. His left arm ceased to exist, deleted from wrist to collarbone. Melzigard screamed, not in pain, but in rage at the diminishment. His regeneration tried to restore the limb, but the tissue grew back wrong, twisted, unable to anchor to reality properly. "Lord Boros," he transmitted through the Ark's dying neural network. "I cannot hold them. You need only slow them." Melzigard laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and threw himself forward again. His remaining arm caught a Wraithguard by the head and crushed pulverizing wraithbone like pottery. Another beam caught him, this time in the abdomen, deleting his lower torso. He kept fighting, pulling himself forward with his remaining arm, leaving a trail of ichor that burned through the webway's crystalline floor. Behind him, the Ark advanced. The Kabbalites struck from the shadows. They came through dimensional tiers. Drukhari raiders from Komarog, drawn by the scent of exotic prey and the promise of specimens for their homunculi masters. 12 warriors in Baroque armor wielding weapons designed not to kill, but to capture. Splinter rifles opened fire, their crystalline projectiles laced with toxins that could paralyze a bullgrox. The darts struck Melzigard's regenerating flesh and dissolved the toxins, ineffective against biology that was already more concept than chemistry. A blaster beam caught the Ark's flank, burning through damaged hull plates. Haywire grenades detonated in clusters, their electromagnetic pulses designed to disable machinery. The Ark's organic systems convulsed, but it was not a machine. It lived, and living things adapted. A Raider Vox specimen acquisition protocols. The transmission cutting short as local topology inverted and compressed the speaker to 2-dimensional flatness. The Drukhari scattered, recognizing the danger. They were predators, yes, but they were also pragmatists. When prey became too expensive, you found easier targets. Half the squad vanished back through their dimensional tears. The remaining 6 pressed the attack, now focused on the Ark itself rather than the dying warrior. Haywire webs deployed nets of crackling energy that wrapped around the ship's sensory organs. The Ark's eyes wept luminous fluid, blinded, groping through the passage like a wounded animal. One Kabbalite got close enough to plant a trophy marker, a small device that would transmit coordinates back to Komorrah, marking this specimen for future retrieval. Boros appeared beside him. The Kabbalite had time to register movement impossibly fast emerging from the Ark's hull, as if the metal itself had birthed him before Boros's hand closed around his helmet. The squeeze was almost gentle. The helmet compressed like foil. The Kabbalite's head went with it. The remaining 5 Drukhari vanished immediately, their pragmatism overriding any sense of honor or vengeance. Let the Homunculi mark this one as too expensive. Let some other cabal test themselves against the living star. Boros dropped the corpse and looked ahead to where the passage opened into a larger chamber, an intersection where multiple webway tunnels converged. And in that chamber, waiting with the patience of the dead given purpose, stood a Wraith Knight. The construct was 8 meters of wraith bone, and Fury, a war machine piloted by the preserved souls of twins who had fallen in battle millennia ago. Its wraith cannon was mounted on its right arm, the weapon large enough to delete entire companies of enemies in a single shot. Its left arm bore a ghost glaive, a blade whose edge existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Behind it, a spirit seer of Ulthwé stood in trance, her consciousness merged with the Wraith Knight's spirit cores, channeling her power to animate the construct beyond its normal parameters. She could feel the wrongness approaching the living star, the thing that should not be. "Doom is set," she whispered into the psychic ether, her words a prayer and a warning simultaneously. The Wraith Knight raised its cannon. Melzagard, dragging himself forward on his single remaining arm, looked up at the construct and understood this was his ending. Not to hunger like Grorabas, not to time like Ger Jugendshoop, but to fate, to an enemy that had already died and chosen to fight anyway. He pulled himself upright, his incomplete regeneration giving him legs that barely functioned, a torso that flickered like a dying flame. The core in his chest, the last core, the final ember, pulsed weakly. He transmitted one final observation. They fought not for survival, but because they were already dead, and the dead feared nothing. Boros's reply was simple: show them what the living could accomplish. Melzagard lunged. The Wraith Knight fired. The beam caught him center mass, striking directly through the core. For an instant, Melzagard existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously present and deleted, his probability wave collapsing in real time. His body remained for 3 seconds, long enough to see Boros approaching, long enough to nod once in acknowledgement of having served to the end. Then the core shattered. Not an explosion or light, but an absence, as if the universe suddenly remembered it had forgotten to include Melzagard in its calculations. His body didn't collapse or dissolve. It simply wasn't and never had been. The only evidence he had existed at all was the trajectory of his final lunge, a vector through space that terminated at the Wraith Knight's feet. Boros crossed that distance in a heartbeat. The Wraith Knight pivoted, bringing its ghost glaive around in an arc that should have bisected any opponent. Boros caught the blade with his bare hand. The multi-dimensional edge bit into his palm, bleeding through into spaces that shouldn't connect to real space. He did not release it. "Fate is a wall," he said quietly. "Walls burn." His eye blazed. Meteoric burst. Not the full power, not yet. That would come later against an enemy worthy of it. But a fraction. A taste. Just enough to remind the galaxy what it meant when a living star grew angry. Purple light erupted from Boros's body, bleeding through the visible spectrum into wavelengths that existed only in stellar cores. His muscles expanded, his flesh superheating until it radiated like a furnace. The air itself ignited, except there was no air in the webway, only the crystalline medium of the passage, and it began to burn. The Wraith Knight's ghost glaive melted in his grip. The construct tried to pull back its pilot souls, screaming psychically, as they recognized the impossible matter achieving temperatures reserved for the hearts of suns. Boros released the blade and struck with his palm. The blow landed on the Wraith Knight's chest with force measured in megatons. The construct's wraithbone armor material designed to resist less cannon fire and melta-beams cracked, fractured, vaporized from sheer thermal transfer. The Wraith Knight staggered backward, one knee buckling. Its cannon arm came up charging for a final shot that would delete them both. Boros' second strike tore the arm off entirely. The cannon tumbled away, still charging its probability deletion field, cycling through target locks. Boros caught it mid-fall and pointed it at the webway's ceiling. "You built walls to escape your dying gods," he said, "but gods die, and walls—" He fired. The beam struck the webway's crystalline roof and punched through, not merely breaking the surface, but deleting a section of the tunnel's fundamental architecture. The wound gaped, exposing void beyond, but the void was wrong. It smelled of rot, of entropy, of biological decay elevated to cosmic principle. Through the wound, something pressed against reality like a face against a membrane. Nurgle's garden had found the breach. The webway screamed. Not metaphorically, the crystalline walls emitted a frequency that translated as pure agony. A structure designed to be eternal, suddenly confronted with its own mortality. Spores began drifting through the breach, green-gray particles that moved with insect purpose, searching for organic matter to colonize. Where they touched the webway's walls, crystalline light dimmed, replaced by a sickly bioluminescence. Boros powered down the meteoric burst, fading. His body was a ruined, skin-charred muscles torn from the strain of containing stellar-level energies. But already he was regenerating, pulling matter from background radiation to restore himself. The Wraith Knight lay before him. Its pilot's souls fled its body, a shattered monument to a civilization's desperate attempt to cheat death. Behind him, the Ark limped forward, its hull festering now with the spores that had drifted through the breach. Ahead, the passage led deeper into the webway, toward Ulthway, toward the Infinity Circuit, toward billions of souls preserved in crystalline eternity. Boros turned away. "Not you," he said to the dying construct. "You fight because you must, because your souls are trapped, given no choice but service." He looked back at the breach at the garden, pressing through at the inevitability of decay, claiming even the Aeldari's masterwork. "I seek those who choose. And you?" The Wraith Knight's remaining eyelids flickered once, twice, then darkened permanently. "Have already made your choice long ago." Farseer Eldorath felt the moment the webway tore. Through the Infinity Circuit, she perceived the breach, a wound that festered, that would not close, that drew corruption like a lodestone draws iron. She saw the spores spreading, saw entire passages consumed by rot, saw futures where Nurgle's influence seeped all the way to Ulthway's core. "Seal this sector," she commanded. "Collapse the tunnels. Let Morlantir and the Wraith Guard phase out if they can, but seal it now." Farseer, they're still now. The psychic charges detonated in sequence, carefully placed explosives of solidified will that brought down tunnel sections like dominoes falling. The webway collapsed behind the retreating Aeldari forces, cutting off entire passages, sacrificing accessibility to preserve integrity. In the sealed-off sector, the Ark of Dominion drifted through darkness, lit only by fungal bioluminescence and the purple glow of its own failing systems. Behind it, Melzagard's absence was a void that could never be filled. Ahead, the Garden of Decay beckoned like an open wound in creation. Boros stood in the observation chamber, alone now in truth. No commanders, no crew save mindless organisms designed only to maintain ship functions. Just him and the dying vessel that had carried him across galaxies. "3 companions I came with," he whispered to the rotting walls. "3 companions I lost. Gorybus to hunger, Ger-Yugenshub to entropy, Melzagard to fate." The spores drifted past the viewport, beautiful in their own horrible way. Intricate patterns of decay, life and death merged into something that transcended both. And still, no one who fights by choice, only desperation, only necessity. The webway tunnel ended ahead, opening into a space that was not space. A garden where physics became negotiable, where diseases sang symphonies, where the line between life and death dissolved into a green-gray blur. The Ark crossed the threshold, and in his throne garden at the heart of all corruption, Grandfather Nurgle looked up from his cauldron and laughed with genuine delight. A visitor, how wonderful, how rare. The webway did not close behind them, it festered, and through that festering wound the garden spread. The garden did not conquer. It welcomed, through the wound in the webway, that festering tear where crystalline perfection met biological inevitability. The Ark of Dominion drifted into a realm where physics became negotiable and entropy wore a grandfather's smile. The transition was not violent. Reality simply softened, gave way, accepted the newcomer with the warm embrace of compost, accepting a seed. The first thing Boros noticed was the warmth, blood-warm, grease-thick, the kind that belongs to things not yet willing to admit they are dying. The second was the laughter children and old men and soil itself, amused by the joke of standing upright. Not malicious, not cruel, just amused, infinitely, eternally amused at the cosmic joke of existence. The Ark's hull was already changing, where Tyranid bioacid had scarred it, where Necron Gauss weapons had flayed it, where the webway's energies had burned it. In all those wounds, something new was growing. Mushrooms the size of fists, their caps weeping luminous spores, moss that pulsed with its own heartbeat, tumorous growths that giggled when touched. The ship's organic systems designed to regenerate were adapting, but adapting wrong. Where clean tissue should have grown, diseased flesh sprouted. Where new armor should have formed, pustules bubbled. The Ark was healing, yes, but healing into something that loved its own corruption. Boros felt it through his connection to the ship, that seductive whisper, why fight, why burn, accept, rest, let entropy take its natural course. He severed the connection. Through the observation port, now clouded with condensation that formed patterns suggesting smiling faces, the garden stretched to infinity. Swamps of luminous sludge where things that might have been trees grew upside down, their roots reaching toward a sky that rained gentle spores. Rivers of pus, warm and slow, carrying rafts of giggling daemons downstream. Mountains of compacted rot, beautiful in their geometric decay. And everywhere life, not the clean life of growing things, but the exuberant life of decomposition bacteria singing in chorus, fungi networking through the substrate of reality itself, viruses dancing through the air like pollen on a spring breeze. It was in its own horrible way perfect. Boros stepped through the hull breach and into the garden. His feet touched the ground, if it could be called ground. Soft earth that squelched, pleasantly warm as fresh bread, smelling of things that had given up and found peace and surrender. The moment his boot made contact, a circle of sterilization rippled outward. The earth beneath him died, truly died, not into decay but into absence, leaving a perfect ring of glass where bacterial colonies had been flash incinerated by his body's ambient radiation. The garden noticed. From behind a tree-sized mushroom that pulsed with bioluminescent joy, something emerged. It was vast, 7 meters tall, and twice as wide, a cascade of diseased flesh that somehow maintained humanoid shape through sheer force of personality rather than skeletal structure. Its belly was a cauldron where new plagues were born. Its face wore an expression of grandfatherly delight. Rotgut, the merry, great, unclean one. Herald of the generous grandfather, looked upon Boros and smiled. Little star. The demon rumbled its voice like fat bubbling in a pan. You burn so brightly, but burning is work. Burning is exhausting. Why not rest? Why not let rot love you? Around them, plague bearers materialized, dozens of the counting demons, each one marking tallies in the air with diseased claws. They counted the moments, 1, 2, 3, searching for when infection should begin. The count faltered. Boros stood in his circle of sterility, radiating heat that kept the spores at bay, and the garden's natural mathematics broke around him. Life moves, Boros said simply. Rotgut's smile widened, splitting his face until it seemed all teeth and tongue. He spread his arms, and from his sleeves poured nurglings, tiny demons of pure joy, giggling as they tumbled through the air toward Boros. They died mid-flight. Flash combusted from the heat radiating off his skin, leaving nothing but ash that the garden's omnipresent breeze carried away. Rotgut observed, still smiling, that Boros was a puzzle. Grandfather did so love puzzles. The great unclean one reached into his own belly, literally reached through the flesh, elbow deep into his intestinal cavity, and withdrew a handful of something that writhed. Seeds, spores, concentrated packets of stasis offering the oldest mercy. Stop striving. Let the garden hold you until motion forgets your name. He threw them. They exploded in the air around Boros like grenades of entropy. Each spore that touched his skin clung rooting into his cellular structure with microscopic tendrils. Not poison, not disease, just drag resistance, the biological equivalent of friction. Turning movement into heat, turning heat into more spores, creating a feedback loop that demanded ever-increasing energy to maintain the same level of activity. Boros felt his regeneration slow. Not stop, he was too fundamentally alive for that, but labor like a runner in quicksand, each step requiring twice the effort of the last. Behind him, the Ark groaned. Its hull was covered now in nurglings, hundreds of them, thousands, an endless tide of cheerful corruption that hugged the dying ship, not attacking, but adoring it to death. Rotgut gestured expansively at the tableau. Fighting was work, burning was work, but accepting was easy. Around them, the garden pulsed with eager anticipation. Beasts of Nurgle, slug-like daemons the size of trucks exuding toxic joy, slithered closer, desperate to play with the new friend. Plague drones buzzed overhead, their riders tallying infection vectors that refused to calculate properly. Boros looked at Rotgut, at the smiling demon who offered oblivion wrapped in acceptance, at the garden that promised rest, peace, the end of searching. He thought of Grorabas, who had burned himself to atoms rather than surrender, of Gerjugenshoup, who had held space-time itself in his dying tentacles, of Melzagard, who had lunged forward even as probability deleted him from existence. They had not rested, had not accepted, had burned until there was nothing left to burn. No, Boros said, and ignited. Meteoric burst. Not the full measure he had learned. Restraint had learned to meter his power across the chapters of his search, but more than he had shown the Wraith Knight, more than he had spent on the Necron fleet, enough to remind the garden what fire truly meant. His body became a star-given flesh. Purple-white light erupted from every pore, bleeding through the visible spectrum into frequencies that biological matter was never meant to perceive. The temperature around him spiked, not gradually, but instantly, jumping from body warmth to stellar core heat in the span of a heartbeat. The circle of sterility expanded, 10 meters, 20, 100. It spread like a shockwave, like the front of a nuclear blast, and where it touched the garden's carefully cultivated decay, something unprecedented happened. The garden died, not rotted, not decomposed. Died, flash sterilized, reduced to its component atoms, then glassified by temperatures that turned organic compounds into smooth, translucent mineral. The swamp beneath Boros's feet became a plain of purple glass. The mushroom trees vaporized, their spores incinerated before they could spread. The rivers of pus boiled, then evaporated, then ionized into their component molecules. And the demons. The Nurglings burst like soap bubbles, their physical forms unable to maintain cohesion against such aggressive cleanliness. The plague-bearers tried to count their way through it, tried to enumerate the laws by which they were being unmade, but the math became impossible. They flickered, faded, were sucked back into the warp with expressions of profound confusion. Even the beasts of Nurgle demons that had survived 10,000 plagues that had carried extinction on their backs simply evaporated. Their joy lasted exactly as long as their material forms, and then both were gone, leaving nothing but steam that smelled faintly of disinfectant. The wave continued spreading. 1 kilometer, 10, 100. It carved a perfectly circular scar through the garden, a wound of absolute sterility where nothing grew, nothing decayed, nothing existed except glass and silence. Rotgut watched his domain burn away and laughed harder. Yes! The great unclean one roared, his belly jiggling with genuine delight. Oh, what a gift. What a gift. You don't just kill, little star, you reject. You deny grandfather's love. Do you know how rare that is? How precious? The demon swelled. His flesh, already grotesque, expanded like a balloon filling with gas. Pustules the size of houses erupted across his skin. From his back sprouted wings, not the leathery wings of dragons, but membranes stretched over bone-weeping ichor that formed constellations of disease as it dripped. He lifted one massive hand, and from the garden itself rose a weapon. A chain vat, a massive cauldron on chains that had boiled 1,000 plagues to perfection. The vat swung through the air like a wrecking ball trailing steam aimed at Boros with the inevitability of a falling moon. Boros didn't dodge, didn't deflect. He raised his palm and caught it. The impact should have shattered continents. The force of the swing could have leveled mountains. But Boros absorbed it, let it flow through him, converted kinetic energy into thermal energy into light, and then he pushed back. His palm strike hit the vat's side with a sound like a star dying. The metal, if it was even physical matter, couldn't contain the thermal transfer. It went white hot, yellow hot, blue hot in the span of a microsecond. The plagues inside boiled, then combusted, then underwent fusion. The vat exploded. Not outward, but inward, collapsing into a point of such concentrated heat that it briefly formed a micro-singularity for a heartbeat of false physics before evaporating entirely. Rotgut staggered backward, his smile never faltering. His form flickered now, the great unclean one's physical manifestation already strained by the sterilization wave coming apart at the seams. His flesh boiled away in chunks. His pustules burst in sequence, each one releasing spores that died before they could take root. He promised to tell Grandfather about the burning friend. Something special would be prepared for their next meeting. His head remained floating for just a moment, still smiling that eternal smile. In the garden, everyone came back eventually, especially the ones who burned brightest. Then he was gone, banished back to the warp, leaving only a stain on reality where his physical form had stood. Boros stood in the center of a glass plane, a perfect circle of sterilization carved into Nurgle's domain. Steam rose from the edges where the garden's warmth met the cold perfection of dead earth. In the distance, he could hear the garden already beginning to reclaim the wound fungi and bacteria working overtime to colonize the sterile zone. But the scar would remain for days, maybe weeks. A void in the garden where even entropy feared to tread. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking not from exertion, but from energy depletion. The meteoric burst, combined with the constant effort of resisting the garden's stasis spores, had drained him more than any previous battle. His internal reserves, the cosmic fuel that powered his body, had dropped measurably. For the first time since entering this galaxy, Boros felt something approaching fatigue. Behind him, the Ark lay crippled beyond salvation. The Nurglings had loved it to death, their hugs leaving the ship's organic systems corrupted beyond the ability to regenerate. It would not heal. It would only fester. Boros turned away from it. He would walk from here, fly perhaps once he had rested, but the Ark, his home for centuries, his companion across galaxies, was lost. 3 commanders, 1 ship, all gone in pursuit of something that might not even exist. He stood in his circle of glass and listened to the silence. And in that silence from somewhere beyond the garden's borders, he heard something new. Drums. Not the giggling bells of Nurgle's realm, not the whispers of Tzeentch's machinations, or the seductive moans of Slaaneish's excesses. These were war drums, battle drums, the sound of an army that had never known defeat marching to a rhythm older than the stars themselves, the sound of skulls being counted. Boros turned toward the noise. At the edge of his glass plane where sterility met decay, the air was cracking. Not tearing like a warp breach, not folding like a webway gate, cracking like reality itself was being struck by something impossibly heavy. A fissure formed. Through it, he glimpsed red. Not the red of blood, the concept of blood elevated to divine principle. The air smelled of copper and rage. The temperature dropped as something vast and hateful approached, drawn by the silence Boros had created, offended by the absence of screaming and the spilling of sacred vita. Something stepped through the crack, 8 meters tall, skin the color of spilled life, wings like burned bone, brass armor that wept steam. Axes in each hand, weapons that had tasted the blood of saints, of primarchs, of beings whose names could crack planets if spoken aloud. And in its eyes, behind the mindless rage of a demon, Primarch lost to the blood god's service, Boros saw something he had been searching for across galaxies. Recognition, not of him specifically, but of what he represented. A warrior. Not a survivor like the Imperium, not a hunger like the Tyranids, not endurance like the Necrons, not fate like the Eldari, not acceptance like Nurgle. A warrior who fought because fighting was the only truth that mattered, because rage was honest, because violence was the cleanest form of existence. Angron the Red Angel, Daemon Primarch of the World Eaters. Lord of the Red Sands stepped fully into the garden and roared. The sound shattered the glass plane, sent shockwaves through the garden that made Grandfather Nurgle himself pause mid-laugh, rolled across the warp like thunder, announcing to all 4 Chaos Gods that something had entered their domains and demanded combat. Boros looked up at the Demon Primarch, at the thing that had once been human, had once been a slave who fought because he had no choice, and now fought because choice itself had been burned away by 10,000 years of rage. And for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, Boros smiled. Not the cold smile of a predator, not the bitter smile of disappointment, but the warm, genuine smile of someone who has spent countless centuries searching and has finally found what they were looking for. Yes, he said simply. Angron's axes came up. The Demon Primarch's wings spread wide, casting shadows that looked like bloodstains across the glass. His roar became a word, a name perhaps, or a promise, or simply the vocalization of infinite hatred given form. "Skulls!" Angron bellowed. "Not here and rot, not now spent." Boros needed to recover to be ready. The intent was clear between them later. He walked forward directly toward the Demon Primarch. Angron raised his axes, ready to strike. But some instinct older than his corruption, some residual warrior's honor made him pause. Boros stopped an arm's length away, looked up at the towering Primarch, let Angron see him fully battered, drained but unafraid. "I am Boros Dominator. I seek a fight chosen, not survived." He held Angron's gaze. Angron stared at him. For a moment, the rage in the Demon Primarch's eyes flickered, not fading but focusing, recognizing not prey, not an obstacle, but an opponent. The axes lowered, slightly, just enough to signal not yet. 3 days. Angron growled. The number was arbitrary, time meant nothing to Daemons, but the intent was clear. Rest, recover, prepare. 3 days. Boros agreed. They stood in the Garden of Decay in a circle of perfect sterility. 2 beings who existed to fight, staring at each other across a chasm of inevitability. Then Angron turned and stepped back through the crack in reality. The fissure sealed behind him with a sound like a great brass door slamming shut. Boros was alone again. He looked at his hands, still shaking, still depleted. He had perhaps 60, maybe 70% of his peak energy remaining. The garden had taken more than he'd expected, and Angron would require everything. 3 days, he repeated to the empty glass plane, and sat down to gather his strength for the battle that would define whether his search had been worth the cost. Above him, beyond the garden's perpetual overcast, the warp itself held its breath. 4 Chaos Gods watched, waited, made wagers, and in his brass throne surrounded by an ocean of skulls, Khorne leaned forward. At last the Blood God thought, "Let me see what you are made of, little star. Let me see if your fire can burn in my realm. Let me see how brightly you bleed." 3 days passed in a realm where time had no meaning. Boros sat on a throne of vitrified stone, the last remnant of his sterilization wave already being reclaimed by the garden's patient advance. Moss crept at the edges, spores settled like snow. But in the circle where he rested, nothing grew, nothing dared. His body had recovered. The wounds that weren't wounds had closed. The energy depletion that wasn't exhaustion had eased from 60% to 70, perhaps 75. Not perfect, not peak, but enough. He could feel it in his core, the cosmic furnace that powered his existence, the star heart that had carried him across galaxies. It burned steadily, reliably, but its fuel was finite. Every regeneration drew from the well. Every activation of meteoric burst consumed reserves that could not be replaced. Not here, not without decades of rest and cosmic radiation to feed on. The garden watched him rest. Grandfather Nurgle had sent no more heralds, no more offers of peace through decay. The message had been received. This one preferred burning. On the third day, or what passed for a day in a realm without sun, the sky cracked. Not tore, not split. Cracked like a bell struck too hard, like reality itself had been dealt a blow from something impossibly heavy. The sound rolled across the garden in waves, silencing even the omnipresent giggling. For the first time since entering Nurgle's domain, Boros heard true quiet. Then came the drums. Not the gentle bells of plague, not the whisper chants of entropy. These were war drums, brass drums the size of mountains beaten by hands that had never known anything but rage. The rhythm was simple, primal, inevitable doom, 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 doom. A heartbeat. The heartbeat of a god whose only prayer was violence. Through the crack in the sky, something bled. Not Nurgle's warm rot, but something hotter, cleaner in its brutality. The color of arterial spray, the smell of copper and burned ozone. The temperature that came from bodies opened and life spilling free. Blood. The crack widened. Brass light spilled through harsh, angular, unforgiving. And through that light, stepping from his realm into the garden, as casually as a king entering a throne room, came Angron. The demon Primarch had not diminished in 3 days. If anything, he seemed more massive, more terrible, more present. 8 meters of transhuman fury wrapped in brass and burned bone wings spread wide enough to cast shadows across the glass plain. His axes hung at his sides, each one the size of a dreadnought's coffin, their chains clinking with a sound like coins falling into a well of skulls. He looked at Boros. Boros looked back. For a long moment neither moved. The garden held its breath. The drums continued their rhythm. And in that space between heartbeats, something passed between them. Not words, not thoughts, but understanding. This was not prey and predator, not obstacle and destroyer. This was what Boros had been searching for across galaxies, an equal who understood that fighting was not about survival or conquest, but about the purity of motion, the honesty of violence, the truth that could only be spoken with fists and fire. Boros stood. The glass beneath his feet cracked from the shift in his body's energy state. "It is time," he said quietly. Angron's only answer was to raise his axes. The drums stopped. For one perfect second, the warp itself held still. Then they moved. The impact could be measured in continental scales. Boros's fist met Angron's descending axe at a point in space that should not have been able to contain such forces. The collision didn't produce sound, not initially. It produced a void, a bubble of absolute silence as the shockwave propagated faster than air could vibrate. Then reality caught up. The crack rolled outward like a physical thing, shattering the glass, plain into crystalline shrapnel, flattening what remained of the garden's encroachment for kilometers in every direction. The ground beneath them didn't just crack at liquefied stone and earth converting to plasma from the thermal transfer alone. Angron grinned. Not a smile, a grin all teeth and bloodlust, the expression of something that had forgotten what joy felt like but remembered the shape of victory. He pivoted impossibly fast for something so massive, bringing his second axe around in a horizontal arc that carved through the air with enough force to create a vacuum wake. Boros didn't dodge. He caught it palm against the flat of the blade fingers wrapping around brass that had tasted the blood of saints. The chain connecting axe to Angron's wrist pulled taut. For a moment, Primarch and Warrior were connected by a thread of consecrated metal, both pulling, both pushing, testing the limits of the other's strength. He liked the force behind those blows. He released the axe and struck palm thrust to Angron's chest, every joule of force concentrated into a point the size of a coin. The thermal energy alone should have vaporized armor. The kinetic force should have shattered bone. Angron took it, absorbed it, laughed. His wings flared, and from between the burned bone membranes erupted something that was not quite flame and not quite blood. It was rage given physical form. Red light that screamed, that cut, that demanded acknowledgement. The wings beat once, and Angron launched himself backward, pulling both axes free in a spray of molten stone. He landed 50 meters away. The ground beneath his feet cracked into a pattern of eights, the eightfold path. Khorne's sacred number appearing unbidden in the tortured earth. Boros stood in his crater, steam rising from his body where his internal temperature had spiked to match the attack. His skin glowed faintly purple heat haze, warping the air around him. This was what he had come for. He exploded forward, not running, not flying, exploding every muscle fiber, converting stored energy into motion, his body becoming a projectile launched by the combustion of his own cellular structure. The distance between them evaporated. Angron met him with axes raised. They collided again and again and again. Each impact reshaped the battlefield. Chasms opened where they struck the ground. The air ignited where they passed, leaving contrails of purple fire and red lightning. The realm itself began to fracture, unable to properly contain forces meant to operate on stellar scales. Above them, bloodthirsters circled, greater demons of Khorne, each one a demigod of slaughter in its own right. But they did not interfere, could not. This was sacred, and even demons understood to interrupt this battle would be to spit on everything Khorne represented. Below them, the earth split into canyons that filled with blood from no visible source. Khorne's realm bleeding through, drawn by the violence feeding on it, growing stronger with every drop of sweat and every burst of energy. Boros activated meteoric burst, not the full measure, just a pulse, a momentary elevation from merely superhuman to force of nature. His speed doubled, his strength tripled. His body temperature spiked until he radiated in frequencies that biological matter couldn't perceive. He struck Angron 7 times in 3 seconds. Chest, shoulder, jaw, knee, elbow, wing joint, sternum. Each blow carried enough energy to level mountains. Each one left burns on brass armor that had survived 10,000 years of warfare. Each one hurt in ways that transcended mere physical damage, reaching into the fundamental patterns that held the demon Primarch's essence together. Angron didn't block, didn't dodge. He took them all, and with each hit his rage grew brighter. His counterswing caught Boros across the torso. The axe didn't just cut, it erased, temporarily disrupting the molecular bonds that held Boros's body together. For a fraction of a second, Boros existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, alive and dead solid and dispersed, present and absent. His regeneration kicked in immediately, burning through energy reserves to restore coherence. His body snapped back together, flesh and bone reforming faster than the eye could track. But the cost was real. He could feel it, a dip in his internal reserves, not large but noticeable, perhaps 2%, perhaps 3%. He powered down from meteoric burst, landed in a crouch, one hand pressed against the ground for stability. Angron stood over him, axes dripping with something that might have been blood or energy or the border between the two. For a moment, Boros thought the Primarch might speak, might gloat, might do something that would shatter the perfect simplicity of what they were building. But Angron only waited, waiting for Boros to stand, waiting for the fight to continue. Not from mercy, but from respect, the understanding that a worthy opponent deserved to face death at their peak, not while recovering. Boros stood. Blood that wasn't quite blood dripped from a wound that was already closing. His smile never faded. Everything aligned. This battle was true. They came together again. The battle escalated, not in violence. The violence had been absolute from the first moment, but in scale. What had begun as a fight between two beings had become something larger, a ritual, a ceremony. With every clash, the boundary between realms thinned. Nurgle's garden receded, no longer able to maintain its hold on space that was being sanctified by combat. Khorne's domain pressed forward, eager, hungry, transforming stone into brass, transforming blood into fuel, transforming earth into an altar upon which the only prayer was motion. The drums had resumed, doom, 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 each beat synchronized with the impacts, not controlling them, but acknowledging them, recording them, ensuring that this battle would echo through the warp forever. Boros felt it as pressure. Not physical pressure, but something deeper, a weight on his very existence, as if the realm itself was watching, judging, demanding more. Each time he moved, each time he regenerated, each time he burned energy to maintain his edge, the cost was slightly higher. Each motion cost a little more, 10%, then 15%, then 20%. Quiet taxes paid in heat and light. It was subtle, insidious. His body performed identically. His speed hadn't decreased. His strength hadn't waned. But the price had increased, and the bill was being paid from reserves that were no longer infinite. After the 20th exchange, or was it the 100th time, had stopped meaning anything, Boros found himself standing in a crater filled with brass-tinged blood. His breathing was heavy, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer energy expenditure of maintaining peak performance in a realm that was actively taxing his existence. Angron stood opposite, wings spread, axes raised. The demon Primarch showed no signs of fatigue. How could he? This was his realm. Every drop of blood spilled fed him. Every moment of rage empowered him. He was fighting at home in front of his god, and that meant he was functionally inexhaustible. Boros calculated rapidly. He'd entered this fight at 75%. 3 prolonged meteoric burst activations, 17 major regenerations, constant environmental pressure from the realm itself. He was at 40%, perhaps 45%. He had enough left for one truly devastating attack, maybe 2 if he was conservative. After that it wouldn't matter, because this was what he'd been searching for. This was the fight that justified the journey, and if he had to burn every last joule of energy in his body to see it through, then that was fitting. Angron stepped forward. His axes dragged through the blood, leaving wakes that steamed. He opened his mouth. For a moment, Boros thought the Primarch might roar, might unleash some devastating psychic assault born of pure rage. But what came out was simpler, clearer, more terrible in its honesty. Don't. Slow. Down. 3 words. A command. A challenge. A prayer to the only god that mattered in this moment, the god of motion, of conflict, of the space between thought and action, where only truth existed. Boros' smile widened. "I haven't started," he replied, and meant it. Because what they'd done so far was preparation, testing, learning each other's rhythms, measuring responses, calibrating force against resistance. They'd been dancing around the true fight, the one that would determine not just who was stronger, but who burned brighter. Boros reached deep into his reserves, not for meteoric burst, not yet, that would come later, but for something simpler, more fundamental. He let his body heat rise, not explosively, but steadily, inexorably, like a star entering its helium-burning phase. The blood in the crater began to boil. The brass beneath his feet softened, then melted, then vaporized into ionized gas. Around him, a pillar of purple-white light erupted skyward, punching through the cloud cover, reaching toward the warp's churning ceiling. It wasn't an attack. It was a statement. "I am here. I am burning. Come test yourself against this flame," Angron answered. His wings ignited not with fire but with something older, something that existed before combustion was discovered. Pure rage given thermal expression. The red light that bled from his form intensified until it hurt to perceive, until daemons watching from the sidelines had to look away or risk having their own hate burned out by proximity to the genuine article. The 2 pillars, purple and red, starfire and blood fury, rose into the sky like twin monuments to violence. And then Angron moved. He didn't sprint or soar. He tore through space itself, his axes leading his wings, propelling him forward with force that left cracks in reality's surface. The distance between them was measured in meters, then centimeters, then nothing. The axes fell. Boros caught them both, one in each hand, palms pressed against brass edges that screamed to be free. His feet sank into molten metal. His arms trembled not from weakness, but from the sheer magnitude of kinetic energy he was currently preventing from expressing itself. They locked together, Primarch and warrior axe edge and palm, in a tableau of perfect opposition. The drums stopped again. In the sudden silence, Khorne himself leaned forward in his brass throne. "Show me the blood god demanded of the universe. Show me what you're made of." and in answer the earth beneath them split. Not a crack, not a chasm, a wound, a massive gouge in reality's surface that revealed something beneath the battlefield. Molten brass flowing like blood through the realm's arteries, the heart of the domain laid bare by the violence of their conflict. Boros looked down into the burning wound, saw the energy there, the raw fuel that powered Khorne's realm, saw how it fed Angron, sustained him, made him functionally immortal as long as he stood in his god's domain, and understood what needed to be done. He couldn't outlast Angron here, couldn't outfight him in a realm that actively worked against one while empowering the other. The only path to victory was the one he'd always known he'd have to take. Total, absolute, final. He released the axes and dropped backward, letting himself fall into the wound, into the brass blood that would burn anything mortal to atoms. His body hit the molten surface and kept falling, sinking into the realm's arterial system, letting the pressure and heat wash over him. Angron roared and dove after him. They fell together deeper into Khorne's domain, past the surface pretense of physicality, into the regions where realm and reality blurred, where the warp's truest nature made itself known. And there, in the depths of the blood god's heart, Boros began to gather his strength, not for another exchange, not for another test, for the final one, the one that would consume everything he had left and answer the question that had driven him across galaxies. How brightly can a living star burn before it goes supernova? Above them on the shattered battlefield, the drums resumed. But the rhythm had changed. No longer the steady heartbeat of war. Now it was a countdown. Doom, doom, doom. Each beat marking the moments until something unprecedented would occur in Khorne's realm. Until a warrior who refused to die would face a god's chosen champion. Until fire met rage at the center of all violence. Until the living star stopped smiling and began counting down. 3, 2, 1, 2. They fell into the heart of rage itself. The wound in the battlefield's surface led deeper than geography should allow, through layers of brass and bone, through strata of crystallized screams and compacted violence, into regions where Khorne's domain was not metaphor, but substance. The walls here were made of something that was simultaneously molten metal and liquid fury, flowing in channels that had been carved by 10 million years of unceasing war. Boros felt the pressure immediately, not crushing his body but taxing his existence, as if reality itself had decided that remaining coherent in this place required a tithe paid in energy. Every second cost more than the last. Every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of continued self drew from reserves that were no longer adequate for the demands being placed upon them. 40% remaining, 39, 38. The drain was subtle, insidious, but undeniable. Angron landed ahead of him, wings spread, axes ready. The Daemon Primarch stood at the edge of a massive chamber, a cathedral carved into the realm's arterial system. Rivers of brass blood flowed along the walls in defiance of gravity, feeding upward into veins that disappeared into darkness above. The floor was a mirror of polished bone, reflecting red light, until the chamber seemed to exist in infinite recursion. And throughout the space, standing like organ pipes in some cosmic cathedral, were pillars of engraved brass. Each one bore runes in the eightfold pattern, each one thrummed with resonance, conducting Khorne's will through the substrate of his realm. Boros landed opposite Angron. His feet touched bone, and frost spread outward, not cold, but the absence of heat. His body drawing energy from the environment itself in a desperate attempt to stabilize his power curve. 37%. He looked at the pillars, at the flowing brass blood, at the way the chamber's geometry created natural focal points, places where sound and light would concentrate, amplify, resonate. A weapon if you knew how to use it, a tomb if you didn't. Angron raised his axes. The gesture was simple, clear. Come, give me everything. Boros smiled for the last time. After this, there would be no more smiling, no more searching, no more questions about what lay at the end of the journey. Only the answer. He moved. The first exchange shattered two pillars. Boros didn't block Angron's opening strike. He redirected it, letting the axe's momentum carry it into one of the brass columns. The impact rang through the chamber like a bell forged in hell. The pillar cracked its runework, bleeding light, and the flow of brass blood along the walls stuttered. Angron's second axe came around in a horizontal arc meant to bisect anything in its path. Boros dropped beneath it, rolled forward, came up with his palm pressed against another pillar's base. He pushed not physically, but energetically, feeding heat into the metal until its molecular bonds couldn't maintain integrity. The pillar exploded from internal pressure, showering the chamber with fragments of consecrated brass. The flow of brass blood reversed. The rivers on the walls began flowing downward, draining into fissures in the floor, suddenly obeying gravity as the realm's carefully maintained structure was disrupted. Angron roared not in rage, but in something approaching approval. His opponent wasn't just fighting, he was thinking, adapting, using the environment as weapon and shield simultaneously. The Primarch's wings beat once, propelling him forward faster than sound. His axes came down in a synchronized strike that should have split Boros along multiple planes of existence. Boros activated Meteoric Burst, just a pulse, just a flash enough to accelerate his perceptions to see the attack coming in slow motion, to twist aside at the last possible instant. The axes buried themselves in the bone floor where he'd been standing, and Boros was already moving, already striking, already pressing the advantage. 7 blows in 2 seconds. Each one aimed not at Angron, but at the environment, at walls, at remaining pillars, at the structural elements that held the chamber together. He was reshaping the battlefield, turning it from Angron's advantage into a neutral ground, into a killing box. 34%. The brass blood flow had stopped entirely now. Without the pillars to channel it, the arteries along the walls were collapsing, draining away, leaving the chamber dry. And without that constant infusion of rage energy, Angron's limitless stamina was suddenly limited. Not much, not enough to matter in a prolonged fight, but enough for what Boros needed to do. He landed at the chamber's center where the bone floor was smoothest, where the geometry of the remaining pillars created a perfect focal point. The acoustic properties were ideal. The spatial arrangement was optimal. This was the resonance chamber, the amplification cavity, the barrel of a gun larger than planets. Angron stepped forward, understanding written in every line of his massive form. He recognized what was being prepared, recognized that whatever came next would be final. The demon Primarch nodded. Once, sharp, a warrior's acknowledgement, make it count. Boros began to gather his power. Phase 1, accretion. Energy didn't flow into Boros, it fell into him, drawn by gravitational gradients that shouldn't exist in real space. Purple-white light began to bleed from his skin, from his eyes, from his open mouth as he breathed out stellar wind. The temperature in the chamber dropped precipitously, not because heat was leaving, but because Boros was consuming it, drawing thermal energy from the environment to fuel the reaction building in his core. The bone floor developed a layer of frost. The air itself began to crystallize, forming geometric patterns of frozen nitrogen and oxygen. The light around him dimmed not because it was being absorbed, but because it was being pulled into such a tight orbit around his body that it couldn't escape. His shadow disappeared. When photons fell into his gravitational well, they didn't bounce back out, 31%. High above in the regions of Khorne's realm that still functioned normally, the cadence faltered, mallets met brass, but sound went nowhere. Every demon in the blood god's domain felt the shift. Something was happening in the heart chamber, something that demanded attention. The bloodthirsters who had been circling the original battlefield descended, landing on the rim of the wound in the earth, watching with the focused intensity of predators, observing a hunt that was beyond their ability to participate in. Angron stood his ground axes raised, waiting. Phase 2. Collapse. The light didn't just brighten, it inverted. What had been purple-white bleeding outward became purple-white being crushed inward, compressed to a point that existed in space but not in any conventional sense of dimension. Boros's body flickered. For an instant, he seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously, or perhaps in no place at all. His physical form becoming merely a suggestion, a probability wave that hadn't yet decided on a definitive state. The point of light in his palm, the size of an atom, the mass of a mountain, the temperature of a young star's core, began to sing. not metaphorically. It produced sound, a frequency so high that it existed beyond hearing, but the remaining brass pillars resonated with it anyway, amplifying it, turning the entire chamber into a musical instrument playing a single impossible note. The cadence returned as absent strikes that made only pressure a silent meter etched into the warp. The note from the collapsing star in Boros's hand rose higher. The brass pillars began to melt not from heat, but from sympathetic vibration, their molecular structure shaken apart by resonance. 26%. Angron threw his axes, not at Boros directly, but at the collapsing point, trying to disrupt it to break the compression before it could achieve critical density. The weapon spun through the air, trailing chains of consecrated brass. Every revolution, a prayer to Khorne, every link in the chain, a verse in the scripture of violence. They struck the gravitational gradient around the compression point and stopped, hung in midair. Then slowly, inexorably began to orbit Boros's outstretched hand, spiraling inward like debris falling into a black hole. Boros screamed not in pain but in effort, maintaining the compression while simultaneously defending against Angron's disruption attempt was costing him energy he couldn't afford to spend. He had to redirect power from his own structural integrity, from his regeneration, from every non-essential system just to keep the reaction stable. 20%. The axes spiraled closer, their chains wrapped around his arm, burning through his flesh, trying to tear the compression point free from his grasp. Boros held on, and the point continued to collapse. Phase 3, or the chamber screamed, not from sound but from the fundamental forces being brought to bear within it. The remaining pillars pushed beyond their resonance limit began to sing in harmony. 8 different notes in 8-fold pattern, creating a chord that existed in dimensions higher than the normal 3. The brass blood that had drained away began to boil back up through the floor, drawn by forces that transcended hydraulics or thermodynamics. It rose in columns and spirals, forming patterns around the chamber's perimeter, like audience members rising to witness something unprecedented. Angron lowered his empty hands, looked at Boros, at the warrior who had burned so far across the galaxy, at the living star who had come to his realm seeking not conquest, but completion. The demon Primarch's rage-twisted features shifted. Just for an instant behind the brass mask and the demon's countenance, something human flickered. Not peace, not forgiveness, but pride. Pride in finding an opponent who understood, who honored the fight by giving everything, who made the battle worthy. Angron spread his wings one final time and roared not a challenge, but an acknowledgement. Burn bright, show them all. The compression point in Boros's hand achieved critical density, and reality broke. Collapsing star, roaring cannon. The release wasn't an explosion. Explosion implied expansion, implied matter seeking to spread across available volume. This was directional, a beam of stellar collapse given trajectory of gravity weaponized of a supernova's dying scream, compressed to the width of a hair and given purpose. The beam was purple-white at its core, but its edges bled red. Not from heat, but from Khorne's realm itself interfering with the emission, trying to claim the violence for its own, wrapping the starfire in blood script like a blessing or a curse, or perhaps both. It didn't travel. It was simply their emission and impact as one. The demon Primarch didn't dodge, didn't block. He took it full in the chest wing, spread axes reclaimed from orbit, and held high, meeting the star's death with the same honor it had shown him. For exactly one heartbeat, Angron existed in the beam. His form was visible as a silhouette, a shape defined by absence, the only thing in the chamber dark enough to show against the impossible brightness. Then, the physical structure gave way. Brass armor vaporized, wings became ash, flesh sublimated directly to plasma. The demon's essence, the core of rage that sustained his existence, was sealed, not destroyed, but compressed, bound, sent screaming back through the warp's tides toward the brass citadel, where it would have to reconstitute itself from scratch. The beam didn't stop. It punched through where Angron had stood, through the bone floor beneath, through layers of realm structure that had stood since Khorne first claimed this domain. It bored down into the brass blood arteries themselves, rupturing them, creating a void where fury had always flowed. The chamber convulsed, walls cracked, the floor shattered into irregular polygons. The remaining pillars, pushed beyond any tolerance, exploded into fragments of singing metal. And the brass blood, the life essence of Horn's realm, drained away through the wound, leaving the chamber cold, not in temperature but in meaning. A void where once there had been only rage. The beam terminated after 5 seconds that felt like eternity. Boros dropped to one knee, then both. His hand, still outstretched from firing, was translucent flesh burned so hot it had become glass, showing the molecular structure beneath. His body temperature had spiked so high during the emission that he was still radiating an infrared visible light, ultraviolet soft X-rays. 8% remaining. 7, 6. The drums above had stopped entirely. Across Khorne's realm, a million battles paused. Bloodletters stood frozen with swords half raised. Bloodthirsters hovered in mid-air wings, motionless. Even the blood god himself, enthroned atop his mountain of skulls, had ceased his eternal counting. One word echoed through the warp, not spoken but felt pressed into the substrate of reality itself by a force that predated language. Worthy. The chamber's walls began to glow, not red but gold brass heated to the point where it transcended its own nature, becoming something precious, something to be remembered. The shattered floor reformed but changed. Where bone had been, now there was crystallized ruby, each fragment catching light and throwing it back in eightfold patterns. A cathedral, not of worship, but of witness. This place would remain, would be preserved, would stand as testament to the day someone had fought in Khorne's heart and emerged not broken, but victorious. Above where the bloodthirsters watched, they slowly, impossibly lowered themselves, not in submission. Khorne's demons did not submit, but in recognition. One knee touched ground, then another, then a third. The greatest warriors in the blood god's service were kneeling, not to Boros, not to any master but their own, but to the fight, to the purity of violence properly expressed, to a battle conducted with such commitment that even rage itself had to pause and acknowledge its beauty. Boros remained on his knees, breathing hard, his body struggling to maintain coherence with only single-digit percentages of energy remaining. His regeneration had stopped entirely, not because he willed it, but because there simply wasn't enough power left to run those systems. Every breath was a calculation, every heartbeat a trade-off. But he was alive, and he had won. Through the shattered chamber, through the wound he'd torn in Khorne's realm, a path opened, brass stairs appearing from nowhere leading upward and outward, an exit. A road back to real space, or at least to less hostile regions of the warp. Khorne's gift to a worthy opponent, the chance to leave. The invitation to return. You have fought in my garden and watered it with worthy blood. The door is open. Come back when you wish to burn again. Boros stood. It took 3 attempts, each one a monumental effort of will over depleted flesh. His legs shook. His vision was fading at the edges, but he stood. And he began to climb. Behind him in the ruby cathedral that had been a killing chamber, the brass blood slowly began to flow again. Khorne's realm was healing, reconstituting itself, preparing for the next war. The next champion, the next worthy soul who would descend into its heart-seeking glory. But in the center of the floor, where the collapsing star roaring cannon had struck, there remained a circle of perfect clarity ruby that had been fused so pure it was transparent, showing depths that went down forever. A scar, a memory, a permanent mark that said here a living star burned so bright that even rage had to bow. Boros climbed the brass stairs, each step an exercise in agony and determination. Around him the warp churned with aftershocks from the battle. Ships in the eye of terror found their navigation suddenly inexplicably skewed. Astropaths across a dozen sectors woke screaming from visions of purple-white light devouring red. At the Cadian gate, a surviving pylon array flickered. Just once, just for a moment, but long enough for the tech priests monitoring it to notice, to record, to file away with the notation anomalous event. Origin Eye of Terror, Classification unknown. In the webway, the few remaining farseers capable of seeing clearly into the Imperium watched the aftershocks ripple outward and understood something had won in Khorne's domain. Not survived, not escaped, won. They added new verses to songs that would never be sung aloud, records for whoever might come after, warnings about stars that burned too bright and the price of seeking them. Boros reached the top of the stairs. Ahead lay the boundary of Khorne's realm, the membrane between one god's domain and the general chaos of the warp. Beyond that, perhaps a way back to real space, to the galaxy, to whatever remained of his journey. He had 6% energy remaining, maybe 5. Enough to walk, enough to think, not enough to fight. He stepped through the boundary and the drumming faded behind him. He stood at the edge of the warp's true madness, a realm where distance and direction were negotiable, where thought and matter were interchangeable, where every step might lead to a new hell or an old memory. Somewhere in this chaos was a path back to the Imperium. Somewhere was a way forward. But first, rest, just for a moment, just long enough to understand what he had accomplished. Boros looked back one final time at Khorne's realm, at the brass citadel rising in the distance, at the rivers of blood that flowed eternal, at the mountain of skulls that marked the blood god's throne. He had fought the chosen champion of a god and emerged victorious, had burned so bright that even rage itself acknowledged his light, but the victory was hollow, perfect, honest, correct, but hollow, because Angron, for all his power, had been bound by rage, had fought because rage was all he had left. There had been skill, yes, respect, absolutely, but not choice. And Boros had been searching for someone who chose the fight, who walked into violence with clear eyes and full understanding, who burned not because they had to, but because burning was truth. He had not found that in this galaxy, not in the Imperium's desperate survival, not in the Tyranid's hunger, not in the Necron's endurance, not in the Aeldari's fate, not in Nurgle's acceptance, not even in Angron's rage. Perhaps it didn't exist. Perhaps what he sought was impossible. Or perhaps, no. Boros pushed the thought away. He had fought his final battle, given everything. The search was over. Now there was only the long walk home, wherever home might be, and the question of whether 6% would be enough to make it there. The living star did not smile again. It began walking through the warp, leaving a trail of cooling embers behind it, searching not for opponents anymore, but for a place to finally rest. And in his brass throne, surrounded by a mountain of skulls that reached toward an impossible sky, Khorne watched it go and smiled his skull-grin smile. "Return the blood," God whispered to the warp. "When you are ready, when the fire has rebuilt itself, return and burn in my garden again. I will wait." The drums began again. Doom, 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 counting down to a rematch that might never come, counting up the skulls that would be collected while waiting. Either way, Khorne was patient. Blood flowed eternal after all, and stars, even dying stars, sometimes found a way to ignite one last time. The warp was not a place, it was a condition. Boros walked through layers of unreality that had no proper names in any mortal language. Spaces where cause and effect held hands, and skipped backward, where thought became substance and substance became memory. Each step left behind a cooling ember, a brief moment of there-ness in a realm that actively resisted definition. 6% energy remaining, maybe 5. His body was no longer regenerating properly. The wounds from Angron's axes had closed, yes, but the tissue beneath was wrong, crystallized in places, translucent in others, as if his cellular structure couldn't quite remember how it was supposed to be arranged. Every movement was calculation, every breath a trade-off between necessary function and energy preservation. He was dying. Not in the way mortals died, not from injury or age or disease, but from simple depletion, a star running out of fuel, a fire consuming its last kindling. But he was not dead yet. The brass stairs from Khorne's realm had ended at a threshold, a membrane between one god's domain and the chaos that existed between them all. Boros had stepped through and found himself in the warp's true face, an ocean of concept and emotion where every drop was a thought someone had once had, every wave a feeling someone had once felt. It was beautiful in its own horrible way. terrible in its own strange beauty. He walked forward because forward was the only direction that made sense to a being who had always moved toward things rather than away from them. Behind him, a voice spoke without speaking. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from angles that geometry insisted couldn't exist. Such determination, such waste. The voice was curious, amused, calculating. It smelled of change, of transformation, of plans within plans that spiraled into fractals of infinite complexity. Tsench, the architect of fate, the changer of ways. Around Boros, the warp shifted. What had been a relatively straight path, or as straight as anything could be in this madness, suddenly sprouted options. Staircases appeared leading up, down, sideways through themselves. Doors materialized, each one showing a different destination: a quiet garden, a roaring battlefield, a throne room, a star-going supernova. "You seek a way home," the voice continued. "I know shortcuts. I know paths that fold space and time like origami. I could return you to your origin in an instant, or grant you power to burn forever, or reshape you into something that never needs rest. All I ask is one small thing, a choice. Choose a door, any door. Let me see which path the living star takes when offered infinity." Boros stopped walking, looked at the doors, at the staircases, at the thousand options being presented to him like a puzzle box designed by a mad god, and kept walking forward, not toward any door, not up any staircase, just forward, in the direction he had been going. Through the space where the doors tried to form, through the paradoxes of stairs that led back to themselves, ignoring all of it with the same stubborn refusal that had carried him across galaxies. The staircases twisted, trying to loop his path back into their structure. He burned through them, not with meteoric burst, just with his ambient heat, with the residual radiation his body still produced. The constructs of Tsinch's will, stable only through careful maintenance of paradox, couldn't maintain coherence when subjected to something as simple as sustained thermal energy. They dissolved like sugar in hot water. The voice laughed, genuinely delighted, not offended. "Ah, you choose the straight line. How wonderfully predictable. How deliciously unpredictable that you would make the predictable choice." The doors closed. The staircases collapsed. The warp returned to its baseline chaos. "Go then, little star. Walk your straight path. But know this, every straight line in my realm eventually curves back on itself. You cannot escape geometry. Not even you." Boros said nothing, saved his energy, kept walking, 5% remaining. The landscape changed. What had been angular and complex became soft, smooth. The harsh geometries of Tsinch's influence gave way to curves that were almost too perfect, too pleasing to the eye. Colors bled together in ways that were beautiful and wrong, simultaneously: purple that smelled like music, blue that tasted like silk, sounds that could be touched and held. Slanesh, the prince of pleasure, the dark muse. The ground beneath Boros's feet became a plain of absolute stillness. Peaceful, no still, as if motion itself had been forbidden here. The air was so calm it felt like drowning in velvet. Every step he took disturbed the silence like a rock thrown into a mirror-smooth lake. Each step spiderwebbed the hush like stress fractures in glass. And ahead at the horizon that shouldn't exist in a realm without proper distance, there was a pause. Not a place. A pause, a gap in the warp's constant churning, a moment of rest that had been frozen and stretched into geographical space. It called to him without words, without sound. Just a promise: you are tired. Stop. Rest. Let the fire go out gently instead of violently. Sleep is not death. Sleep is mercy. Boros felt his footsteps slow, not from choice, but from the simple reality that forward motion required energy, and energy was something he had very little of. The stillness wrapped around him like warm water, like a blanket, like acceptance. His next step took 10 seconds to complete. The one after that took 20. At this rate, he would stop moving entirely within the hour, and once stopped, he would never move again. Would sink into this perfect silence, become another frozen moment in Slanesh's collection of beautiful failures. Boros closed his eye, not in surrender but in focus. His star heart, the cosmic furnace at his core that had powered him across galaxies through wars past, death itself still burned, faintly. A guttering candle compared to what it once was. But it burned, and things that burn do not stop. They flicker, they dim, they die, but they do not stop until the fuel is completely exhausted. He took another step, then another, each one an act of pure will over physics that demanded he conserve energy over a realm that demanded he rest. The plane of stillness cracked beneath his feet. Not from force, but from wrongness. His continued motion was an insult to this place's nature, and the warp had to reconcile the contradiction. Where his foot landed, cracks spread outward, each fissure releasing a tiny puff of steam as the absolute stillness met the faintest warmth and couldn't maintain its grip. He left a trail of fractured silence behind him, moving one agonizing step at a time through a realm that promised rest and delivered only stagnation. No voice spoke this time. Slaanesh did not bargain or cajole. The realm simply let him pass, recognizing that this one could not be seduced by promises of ending. He was too stubborn, too stupid perhaps in the way that determination often appears stupid to those who have learned to compromise. The plane ended. The stillness broke, and Boros kept walking, 4.5% remaining. He found the way out through instinct older than thought. His star heart, even depleted, could still sense other stars, could feel their gravitational pull across the barriers between real space and the warp. And ahead, close enough to matter, there was one, a yellow dwarf, young in stellar terms, burning steadily in the Imperium. A chance to recharge, to bask in another star's radiation, absorb its energy, restore some fraction of what he'd spent. If he could reach it. The path between here and there was not clear. The warp didn't deal in straight lines once you started looking for specific destinations. There were complications nodes where traffic passed between realms checkpoints, where various entities maintained watch areas where the materium and immaterium scraped against each other and created friction. And where there was friction, there were those who exploited it. Boros approached one such node, a relatively stable aperture, where warp and real space maintained a thin membrane rather than an absolute wall. Through it, he could sense the star he needed. Could almost taste its photons on instruments that transcended conventional senses. But he could also sense others. 3 distinct groups drawn to this same location for different reasons, but unified in their interest in whatever had caused the disturbance in Khorne's realm 17 days ago. The Imperium had arrived first. A strike cruiser of the Grey Knights, its hull inscribed with wards that made even the warp recoil slightly. Aboard 100 space marines who existed to fight demons, an Ordo Malleus Inquisitor Exterminatus authority in tow, and enough firepower to sterilize a moon. The Chaos Warband had arrived second, a ragtag fleet led by a vessel whose name translated roughly to blasphemy's reward. Black Legion. Colors demon engines lashed to the hull. Lord Discordant commanding forces that served neither Khorne nor any other god exclusively, but rather worshipped the abstract concept of ruin itself. And watching from the shadows of a carefully maintained webway portal, an Eldari scout vessel. Ulthway colors. Not here to fight, but to observe. To ensure that whatever happened next didn't spill over into the webway or threaten any craft worlds. All 3 factions had detected the anomaly. All 3 had weapons trained on the region where the warp membrane was thinnest. All 3 were waiting to see what emerged. Boros stood at the threshold, feeling their attention like pressure against his skin. He calculated rapidly. If he went through, he would be fired upon immediately. His energy reserves couldn't sustain both reaching the star and defending against concentrated fire from 3 different sources. The mathematics simply didn't work. But if he stayed here, he would run out of energy entirely within hours, days at most. And then there would be nothing, not death exactly, but something worse. A slow fade into non-existence, his star heart guttering out in the darkness between realms. He had to go through, had to reach the star. Everything else was detail. Boros stepped forward and the warp shifted, not naturally, not randomly. This was deliberate, a trap sprung at exactly the right moment. The path ahead looped back on itself, creating a Mobius topology that would return him to his starting point no matter which direction he walked. Tzeentch's final gift, a proof that every straight line eventually curves. Boros felt the trap close around him, felt his footstep land exactly where he'd been standing 3 seconds ago despite walking forward. Felt the geometry of the realm twist into a shape that had no exit, only eternal recursion. 4% remaining. 3.9, 3.8. The trap was draining him, not through attack, but simply by forcing him to expend energy moving without actually going anywhere. A perfect prison for something that existed by motion. Boros stopped walking, stood still for the first time since leaving Khorne's domain, and reached down into his reserves, into the final dregs of power that he'd been saving, that he'd been rationing so carefully, and activated meteoric burst for exactly half a second. Not to attack, not to fly, just to phase shift. His body temperature spiked to stellar core levels. The space he occupied became so energetic that reality itself struggled to maintain its grip on him. For that half second, he existed in a quantum state, simultaneously here and not here, subject to the warp's geometry and also completely exempt from it. He chose the axis no labyrinth planned for the perpendicular to fate and stepped. The trap shattered. The path opened. And Boros stumbled through the membrane into real space, his energy dropping precipitously from the expenditure. 3% remaining. He emerged in hard vacuum in the outer reaches of a system dominated by a yellow dwarf star. 2 rocky inner planets, 1 gas giant at the system's edge, and between the inner worlds orbiting at a comfortable distance from its star, a hive world. 40 billion souls packed into 3 city spires, imperial banners flying from orbital platforms, a shrine to the god emperor visible from space, a cathedral the size of a mountain built at such expense that 3 other worlds had been taxed to starvation to fund its construction. And surrounding the hive world, arriving from different vectors but all converging on the region where Boros had appeared, 3 fleets, weapons hot, ready to fire. The Grey Knight's strike cruiser, Malleus Imperialis, locked weapons immediately. Lance batteries charged, psi cannons oriented toward the Xenos signature. Aboard the bridge, Inquisitor Kalith Varn studied the Pixty screens with cold calculation. The thing that had emerged was humanoid in shape, but read as nothing. Not human, not Xenos, not demon, just a blank spot in reality radiating heat that shouldn't be possible for something that size. She opened Vox across all frequencies, her voice carrying the absolute authority of the Emperor's Inquisition. Target the anomaly. Open fire. The Black Legion warband attacked from the opposite vector. Blasphemy's reward unleashed a barrage of demon engine ordnance shells that screamed with the voices of imprisoned lesser demons missiles that trailed blood-red contrails through the vacuum. The Lord Discordant who commanded them laughed over corrupted Vox, a trophy from the Eye itself. Capture it if you can, kill it if you must, but let no one else claim this prize. And from the webway portal's edge, barely visible to conventional sensors, the Aeldari scout vessel transmitted a single message through the psychic network to any who could hear, "Do not burn the sun. Billions live below." Boros heard them all, registered the threats, the demands, the warning, and flew directly toward the star. The star was not large, barely 1 solar mass, yellow-white, unremarkable by cosmic standards. But to Boros it was salvation. A font of energy, a battery he could drain, a chance to restore enough power to survive what came next. He approached its corona, that region where the stellar atmosphere began to thin into space, but still carried enough density to matter. The temperature here was 6,000 degrees, hot enough to vaporize any conventional material instantly. Boros spread his arms and drank. Not through his mouth or lungs, through his skin, through his cells, through the fundamental mechanisms that had powered him since before he could remember. Photons struck his body and were absorbed with near-perfect efficiency. Radiation that would have killed anything biological was metabolized, converted, stored. The stellar wind washing over him became fuel. His energy gauge ticked upward, slowly, painfully slowly, but upward. 3.2%, 3.4, 3.6. The fleets opened fire, Lance strikes from the Imperial cruiser cut through the star's corona, creating visible channels where superheated plasma was pushed aside by the beam's passage. The shots converged on Boros's position with millimeter precision, guided by targeting systems that had been blessed by tech priests and tuned to destroy demons. The beam struck him, burned through his outer layers, would have killed anything else instantly. Boros redirected the energy, let the lance's thermal payload feed into his absorption mechanisms, turning an attack into supplemental fuel. The beams passed through him and struck the star's photosphere, creating temporary dark spots that would heal in minutes. The Chaos Ordnance came next, shells that exploded into clouds of warp-tainted shrapnel missiles that phased between reality and unreality to bypass conventional defenses. They detonated around him in a sphere of consecrated violence, each blast meant to tear holes in the boundary between materium and immaterium. Boros bent their trajectories, not through telekinesis, he wasn't a psyker, but through gravitational manipulation, his mass temporarily spiking high enough that the projectile's flight paths curved around him like light bending around a black hole. They spiraled into the star, instead their demon cores screaming as they were immolated by fusion fire. He didn't fight back, didn't counterattack, just absorbed, redirected, endured. Because fighting would cost energy, would push him back down the gauge he was desperately trying to refill. And more importantly, fighting back would risk damaging the star, the very thing he needed to survive. 3.8%, 4.2. It would take hours at this rate to reach even 10%, days to return to anything approaching combat ready. He didn't have hours. The fleets were repositioning, calculating new firing solutions, preparing to escalate. And worse, they were converging, moving closer to the star, tightening the net. Soon they would be close enough that their weapons' missed shots would start hitting the hive world below. Civilian casualties would mount. The Imperium would blame the Chaos forces. Chaos would blame the Imperium. The Eldari would intervene to prevent webway contamination. The system would become a war zone. The star would be damaged in the crossfire. The hive world would burn. All because he was here. Boros opened his eye. The purple light dimmed but still present, and looked down at the hive world spinning below. 40 billion souls who had no idea what was happening above them, who woke this morning worried about quotas and tithes and whether the Prometheum refineries would meet their goals, not about gods and stars and forces beyond their comprehension. He could stay here, keep absorbing energy, reach maybe 7 or 8% before the fleet's sustained fire overwhelmed the star's regenerative capacity. Then watch as the system tore itself apart, trying to claim or destroy him. Or he could leave the star, draw the battle away from the civilians, accept that he would never recharge fully, never return to even a fraction of his former power, accept that what came next would be fought with empty reserves and fading light. Boros took one last long drink of stellar radiation, pulling energy as fast as his damaged systems could process it. His gauge climbed to 7%, 7.5, 8. Not enough, not nearly enough, but all he was going to get. He released his connection to the star and began descending toward the hive world. Behind him, the fleets followed, all three abandoning their orbital positions, committing fully to the hunt. Imperial, Chaos, Eldari, united only by their determination that whatever this thing was, it would not escape. They chased the living star down through layers of atmosphere, through clouds that boiled away from his passage, through air that screamed as he fell, toward a hive world, toward 40 billion souls who were about to discover that the universe was larger and stranger and more terrible than they'd been taught, toward the place where this would end. The living star did not smile, did not rage, did not pray. It simply fell, conserving energy for what would come next, accepting the price for one last burn. One more time, it thought as the ground rushed up to meet it. One last chance to find meaning in the fire. Let it be enough. The hive spires grew larger in his vision. The fleets opened fire again, their weapons painting the sky with light. And Boros, with 8% energy remaining and nothing left to prove, descended to give the galaxy one final demonstration of what it meant to be a living star, even a dying one.